Hello. How are you? I thought I'd do something a little different today. We'll see how it works out. This is, I guess for lack of a better term, going to be a reaction stream. We are going to play the Secrets of D&D Dungeon Mastering with Chris Perkins video, and we're going to talk about it. I've not done this kind of thing before. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully, a few things I'm looking for. I'm going to have to use my headphones so I can get the audio, and hopefully this won't affect. I don't think it should bleed through. My headphones are open back, but I don't play things very loud. And hopefully you'll get the video, or the audio rather, on the other side. And I'm going to be pausing in between bits to talk about it. I think the original video runs a little bit less than an hour, 51 minutes and 56 seconds. So expect this to run a little longer, and hopefully we don't have any issues, and we'll just be able to go in. I haven't really watched it. I think I saw a couple of tidbits of the video, but other than that, I'm kind of going in blind. So we'll see. But I've heard good things about it, and I am curious. Right? I think he is, as much as anybody, someone who is sort of representative of D&D as it is now. And what kind of stuff does he recommend? And does that stuff translate well if you're playing an older version of D&D or an offshoot thereof? So let me get things swapped over. All right, headphones on. Let me know if you don't get sound.
Hello, everyone. Today we are actually going through some really fantastic Dungeon Master tips with Chris Perkins. We've got a great new book out.
Fandelver and Below, The Shattered Obelisk.
Fantastic. Let's just kind of dive in. You've obviously got a lot of Dungeon Master knowledge.
We got some intro stuff here.
So what is some of your best advice for those who are a player or maybe completely new to D&D, trying to figure out, like, is this the moment I should be Dungeon Mastering? Is this the moment to take the leap?
Well, Todd, for those who don't know me,
hey,
I'm Chris Perkins. I'm
wrong Todd.
Architects of
Different Todd.
Dragons, and I have been
Go
DMing
Team
since
Todd.
I was 10 years old, which is a long time. Let's just leave it at that. But I put together a presentation
dim sum tea for the working man.
Gave at the recent San Diego Comic-Con, and then did an updated version of that presentation at Gen Con. And this, what we're doing now, is sort of a version of that. It is this presentation I put together, which is aimed at both new and experienced DMs. So I'm going to basically walk through the roles that a Dungeon Master plays, and then we're going to have a little fun along the way, giving tips and offering some advice for some situations that do come up in the course of the game.
Let's go.
After you've watched this, if you're a new DM, you'll come away thinking, oh, there are some helpful tips here. If you're an experienced DM, you might go away thinking, well, I didn't learn anything new, but I feel validated.
I'm all for validation.
Very fair. Yeah, that's my...
So without further ado, first question is, what is a Dungeon Master? A,
what is a Dungeon Master? The eternal question.
B, a storyteller. C, a referee. Or D, all of the above.
Oh, come on now.
I feel like D.
D is the correct answer.
Perfect.
Yes,
I have survived.
It's more than that. A Dungeon Master is also an actor, a director, a teacher, and an improviser. That is a lot of roles.
So I think the thing to note right off the bat here, right, is those. If I could scrub. Can I scrub back slightly? Okay. I guess. I mean, I can see it both ways, right? Certainly, I think when you look at kind of modern D&D, the DM is definitely morphed into actor. I mean, obviously, improvising's happening, but I think everybody at the table is improvising. Players are improvising all the time. Playing your character is 90% improvising and 10% dice, I guess. Teacher, in terms of, I guess, but usually the GM is usually the one who is most familiar with the rules. So I guess they can take on teacher, and I suppose they are director. I mean, I guess ultimately, even looking back at old school gaming, we could see that there's some of that role in the GM in terms of, even if it's not codified as such, usually the GM, it's his table, his game, and that usually puts the GM in that sort of teacher position. There are definitely directorial things that are left up to GM often. Stuff if we want, I hate to use cinematic terms, but stuff like, hey, when to end a particular scene or movement and move on is usually something that is left to the GM, which would be kind of a directorial decision. Also, in terms of what you focus on, who you focus on, do you look at one player or another player? Do you start, how you start describing a scene? Those are all things we could put, or scene, scenario, moment, we could put in director stuff. So I think for me, as I look at it at first blush, I go, I want to kind of recoil at actor, director, teacher. I guess ultimately, I think I do those things. In my home game, I had to teach my players the system that we're playing, and certainly do acting and improvising. So I guess all told, even though I feel like maybe when I think of the influence of Critical Role and whatnot, that a lot more has been placed on the sort of actor and director. Those things do fit. Hey, Brian Smith, referee complete with a whistle. I should have a whistle.
That is a lot of roles for one person to play at the table. And all of us DMs are better at some of those roles than others. And those of us who have been DMing a long time have found tips or tricks or ways to sort of up our game in the areas or the roles where we're not the most comfortable or the most able.
Right.
So
just want to add also that, you know, you don't have to necessarily engage with all these, like the actor with a capital A. I know in terms of that sort of Matt Mercer effect, feeling like we have to be great actors for NPCs. You don't have to. I will often just describe the manner in which an NPC is doing something or saying something in lieu of trying to act it out. And I think that's totally fine. And also the GM is, I think, like I said a minute ago, is often the person who's kind of the rules expert, but that's also not necessarily true. So yeah, you can also up your game. You can also bring in your players into some of these responsibilities, and you can also let go of some of these. And I think feeling like if you're the GM, you have to be the master of all this stuff can make GMing more of a burden than it needs to be. So Dave says they feel like a DM's job is to add chaos. When the players want to do something, the game master says your action, small victory, causes catastrophe. I mean, I think that's a great way of looking at it. The GMs are definitely there to engage with the chaos, for lack of a better word, adding complications. Because if the players just did everything they wanted to do, boy, that would just be a boring game. So everything the players do, there has to be some reaction from the world, and that's totally the GM's job.
So what I'd like to do for the remainder of this presentation is take each of these dungeon mastering roles and give one tried and true tip, and then intersperse a few little Q&As in between. So
RW says that answer makes reffing sound like a horrible real world job. I think, I mean, I guess the thing that's unspoken, right, is that it should be fun. You should find this stuff fun. And if you look at some combination of those things, and like I was saying before, when I first look at it, part of me thinking on to the types of change that Critical Role and stuff has kind of, I don't want to say they put in the game because they were already there, but maybe enhanced or put to the fore, the acting, the directing, the kind of making cinema, I can't want to say cinematographic, but not cinematic, the sort of cinematic version of D&D brings, certain things up. But when you kind of drill down, you can say, well, wait a minute, we do all these things, but maybe I would lowercase a that stuff instead of maybe giving it sort of an uppercase letter intention. But of course, the thing is that you should find this fun. And if you don't find this stuff fun, try it. But if you don't find it fun, then maybe, GMing isn't for you. And not everybody, needs to, or has to, or should do a GM. But I think everyone should give it a try, because you never know. And like so many things in life, often they seem worse before you try them, or having not tried them, than they are when you actually do try them.
So the first thing is world building. The Dungeon Master is a world builder. That means that the Dungeon Master is responsible for creating the setting in which the campaign or the adventures happen. And there's a lot to a campaign setting to think about. If you're thinking about it on the world scale, it can be quite daunting, which is why my tip for world building is start small. It can be very tempting to bite off more of the campaign than you can chew, or more of the campaign that the players will even experience.
Right.
And DMs are busy people. They have lives. They don't have infinite amount of time to get their setting off the ground. But if you start small, you have a better chance of actually creating content that the players will experience and use and enjoy. And by small, I mean, maybe your campaign starts at a village. So detail the village, define some of the personalities of the NPCs who live there, flesh out some of the locations that are important. And then if there are areas around the village, like maybe there's a dungeon nearby or a haunted castle or a ruined tower on a hilltop, these close by locations can serve as the starting places for the characters to explore in their early adventures.
I mean, this is kind of the advice that I know I've given a bunch of times. Lots of people have, right? Start small, bottom up. I mean, I think it's perfect advice for any sort of campaign, I would imagine. Don't go inventing the whole world if you don't need to. Start with a village, put a couple of things around it. I mean, that was what Chicago Wiz's three hex rule, or his 3 hex, right? You have a starting spot, a point of interest, and maybe 2 other hexes around, or 1 other hex, and bam, and kind of same kind of deal. And I think that often GMs will think they need to do too much, or they look at the Lord of the Rings map, or they look at the Game of Thrones map, they think, oh, I have to have several continents and all this acreage and mileage and miles and miles and miles of countryside and things, and you don't. So I mean, at least in terms of this first bit of advice, spot on. I think it's as important version of the game. The Dave says they absolutely agree with the start small approach. Absolutely. R-Dubs says all that comes naturally while dicing as a GM with players on tables. I think I see my role as a ref, as a leader that prompts, guides, and makes calls as needed. Yep, those are definitely. I think I really, that's why I really like referee as a term, because I feel like other than the world building part, which is certainly right, a referee doesn't invent the rules of the sport as they are reffing it. The rules are already there, but I think there's kind of 2 main elements of GMing. One is that world building, where you're kind of building the world, and then the second one, when you're in that world, is refereeing. And then of course you have to jump out to do stuff as you're creating content around what the players are doing, but the reffing aspect is totally getting things, making rulings, being that agent of chaos, and dicing and a little bit giving guidance and all that stuff. Dave says, if people can live their entire lives without leaving their city, there's no reason your world needs to be much bigger than a city. Yes, absolutely. Brian Smith asks, well, what about the scheduler aspect? Well, I don't know if he's going to get to it. I think that ends up being one of those burdens I think is often put on the GM that in a perfect world would be spread around the players, where the players would feel excited and want to schedule themselves. I know that's kind of one of the whole West Marches ideals, or one of the things that they want to get to is, hey, the players schedule. But yeah, I mean, that is one of those things that ends up being kind of the onus, unfortunately, is often put on the GM. And I don't know how to fix that other than just training your players or making hard decisions like, hey guys, I'm not going to schedule the game. You guys schedule it. I'll let you know, and then call me. Maybe they call you, maybe they don't. I'm not sure how else to settle it, because it must be, I mean, I can just imagine the difficulty around trying to get folks who have been used to doing it the way that most people have been doing it for ages and ages. The Dave says they leave scheduling to the players. They tell them the days they can run the game and they schedule it. Bam. I mean, my players, I'm looking up that my 2 players will do that also, but I'm definitely aware that I'm way in the minority.
That is enough of a campaign right there to get things off the ground. Right there, you've got several sessions of play that can happen. Starting small means that you won't waste a lot of effort describing places that the characters might never go to. So question, where should one keep one's campaign notes?
Oh,
This is interesting.
I'm terrible about this.
In a journal or notebook.
Right.
B, in folders on a computer. C, in a wiki. Or D, in an online virtual tabletop.
Well, I'm a mix of A and B.
Whatever works best for you.
Correct.
Mostly because I'm too lazy.
All of those answers are fine. It was a trick question. There wasn't just one correct answer. It is a matter of DM choice. And one of the beats I'll hit later is that DMs are individuals. They have their own ways of organizing their information, and however works best
R-Dubs is also A and B.
Is great.
Yeah, I'd like to pick one, but I can't because I'm scattered.
That the player characters could actually add to. That was helpful. But my stock and trade is keeping a journal and a notebook, as well as some computer files. But whatever floats your boat.
Perfect.
Another
Lots
question.
of boats, lots of
How
floats.
much time should be spent preparing for a game session? A, none. B, an hour or two at most. C,
Oh, this is gonna be.
as
I'd love to
many
do a
hours
poll
as you
based
can
on this.
spare. Or D, depends.
It's gonna
gonna
be.
have to go with
They're going with
depends.
D, but I feel like
I have
the
been burned
platonic
many
ideal
times.
would be
Todd
none.
wants to go with depends. Yeah.
Oh, I'll get there. Trust me.
But you are correct. The answer is it really does depend. You might be playing
Hey,
D&D
everyone.
at the
Thanks
drop
for
of a
joining
hat,
from
at a
Brazil.
moment's notice, without any prep, in which case you just don't have time to prepare, and that's totally valid. You may be running a pre-published adventure that doesn't require a lot of prep. Great. For you, preparation might be the most fun activity of the
R Dubs is spelling out the hashtag zero prep supremacy
into it, and that's marvelous.
or
because
hashtag
it's
prep
a
addiction.
wonderful
Yeah,
escape. So it really just depends
I'm
on the
usually
individual
0 to
and the
1 or 2,
circumstances
depending on the time I've
of
got.
the game that you're going to be playing. So for those who are curious, my typical prep for my campaigns consists of 1, a campaign recap, which
This
I
is
write
interesting.
ahead of time. It's basically like a paragraph of text, and it's similar to what a lot of TV series do to get people up to speed on what's happened if it's a
No,
serialized
hold on a minute.
story.
Hold on. I want to go back to that list for a second. I know he's going to play it, but I wish they would have kept the list up. Can I scroll? I just want to. No. What? How? No. Oh, what can I go to? Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is Chris Perkins' prep list: a campaign recap, a list of friendlies and foes, a list of planned events or encounters, and a map. These are really interesting. I never really thought about trying to put more structure on what my prep is. I don't think that gets talked about a lot. I think often people will spout advice about kind of what you should prep or how much time you should spend prepping or that kind of thing. But actually putting a structure on, say, a prep session is kind of interesting. And I think these are good. I guess I know this is not technically, well, I don't know if this is sort of part of his advice or whatever, but this is another good piece of advice. I think a recap is always good. I try to do that as I go, but sometimes I forget. And when I would do them on stream, it'd actually be helpful because I'd have to rethink about all the things that happens. I mean, that's good. List of friendlies and foes that are out there, also good. List of planned events or encounters, regardless of how you're coming up with them, whether it's a narrative-based campaign and you know what's going on ahead, or you rolling those dice and just seeing what the results are as far as what's coming. And then a map, which can just be anything. It can be the hex map, it can be the dungeon map, they're in dungeon or whatever. You could probably even just use some kind of mind map just to put the nodes out there and the connections. All good stuff. Ardub says that actually today they're running an NPC party to move them through the dungeon for our next session. It's how I get my own player time in. Nice. Ian says maybe that'll be a chapter in DMG 2024. I mean, it should be. I mean, I know we only just started. We're like 6 minutes in, but so far so good. And it feels like you want to ask the question of, well, okay, you've put this on YouTube, which is great, and you've given this. He said at the front, he's given this particular presentation at something Gen Con and then something else, which is also, or maybe it was San Diego Comic Con and then Gen Con, which is great. But yeah, I think this is good enough so far, anyway, that I would say, why hasn't this been written up and put into a DMG, especially stuff like this, which is both practical and I think could really be, helpful for folks, especially new folks who haven't been doing this for a while. And so they may not get that kind of blank page syndrome where you sit down and say, great, I got to prep. And then it's kind of like, well, oh, what am I doing? Whereas this, I think, is a nice structure. I mean, you talk about kind of Dungeon 23 and these sort of structures, things you put around a notebook, like have a notebook where you do this on every one of the pages for each session. Recap, friendlies and foes, what's coming next, map. Or if it's in a notebook, maybe you have, either you could draw in a little map if it helps, or just to reference wherever they are on whatever map they're in. Ryan Smith says they think it's common for people to feel prep as a creative session, and learning to manage your own creative process is not easy. No, and that's why I think this stuff is really helpful, because it's oftentimes this kind of structure that can help get people over that hurdle of that blank page, of that not being focused when it comes down to it. Now, granted, this won't work for your first session because you won't have a recap, but being able to focus, say, okay, I need these things, I need these things, and these things is helpful. I mean, even for me, I can see this trying to try this structure might be super helpful.
Right ahead of time. It's basically like a paragraph of text. And it's similar to what a lot of TV series do to get people up to speed on what's happened if it's a serialized story. Previously, in this campaign, and the reason I write that recap ahead of time is one of the things I like to do in planning for the current session is to look back through my notes to see if there's anything that happened in the past that needs to be brought forward or is going to be relevant or important, and I want to remind the players that that happened. And so I will craft the recap looking into the past, just a very quick nutshell summary, so the players at the very start of the session are reminded of all the important details to sort of.
So I guess one thing he does that recap, it seems like he hasn't said it specifically, but it seems he's implying or saying or suggesting that he takes that recap and then reads it off at the beginning of the next session. Now, what I've been doing is having my players give the recap at the beginning, which can be a lot of fun, and I'll kind of correct a little bit. But this interesting thing about this is by being the GM that does it. So there's a couple of things, right? I like the I guess the benefit to having the players do it is they're immediately engaged up front and they're remembering what's happened, or you're getting them to remember, and it encourages them to take notes and to kind of be ready to give each other guidance and get back up to speed, which I think is good. On the flip side, one of the things he's saying here is that by making this little recap, you can kind of focus the party. So the party spent a whole bunch of time mucking about, not doing anything, but there was kind of one important thing here. And then, some more stuff goes on. Maybe in the player recap, which might then set the tone for the session they're coming. If it's the players doing it, they may not remember the important thing. They might remember just the mucking about. And so their recap is something like, oh, well, we were mucking about in town, and oh, maybe there's that. And then we finished up doing whatever. But by you crafting it, you can minimize the mucking about in town in a little nutshell recap, and instead you could focus on the thing that they need to really get going forward, which is like, oh yeah, we met the Duke, and the Duke said something, and then that becomes, you get to kind of refocus things on that detail that's the important thing, as opposed to the players who may in their recap from their eyes might have forgotten about or become overshadowed by whatever mucking around. Let's see. Brian Smith says, last session, you all burned that village down and orphaned the children. Glares at players. Could definitely be one recap. R-Dub says, the players log the play and recap for me. It pulls them in deeper. I agree. And like I just mentioned, I think that's definitely good. But I feel like there's something with this that's interesting too, in terms of, and he's not saying it specifically, but it's definitely in what he's saying is that, or implied anyway, is that you get to kind of focus in, right? Because you're, like it says here, you're reminding them of the important stuff. So it's both a recap, but it's also a little bit of like, hey, let's focus. And you as a GM, frankly, you get to steer that a little bit, which is probably no bad thing. Dave says they like having players get the recap too. Feels like it gives me an understanding of what they found important and valuable. Yep, very true. And then Brian Smith says, I wish I could add a cool voice effect through Zoom to do the previously on recap. You probably can. There's got to be voice filters you can click on and off for that, Brian Smith. I'm
sort of frame what
betting
I expect
there
to
are.
happen in the game coming.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And you never know what is going to spark like a new idea in you, especially coming from the past.
Yes, and it might be quite short. It might be as simple as, previously in the last session, your characters helped this mountaineer out of a snowdrift, defended him against a pair of attacking crag cats, and then with his help marched up the mountain to the Yeti cave.
Ooh, what are crag cats?
It might be as simple as that, or there might be more to it.
Don't bother the Yeti.
I
Leave the
also,
Yetis
as part of
alone.
my prep, create a list of friendlies and a list of foes. It's just an NPC list, basically. A reminder to me of which NPCs do I think are going to surface in the game. If I write down their names, it means I won't forget them or mix them up later.
That's another good point.
I also create a very, very short bulleted list of planned events and encounters. Now, an experienced DM knows that players often take the game in unexpected directions, but that's okay. As part of my prep, though, I still like to anticipate where the session is likely to go. Like, I expect this thing to happen first, then I expect them to do some shopping, then I expect them to march to this location, and then I expect this big thing to happen. That way, at least I've thought about it.
Right.
There might be no deep.
So, I just want to point out here that he's not suggesting that you're railroading the players and they're just going on this linear pathway. But at the same time, which I think, again, makes sense, is to the extent that you can think about where the party is likely to go and you can get that stuff ready, presuming that they follow on what was agreed upon or however they said they were going to go, then you're kind of ahead of the game. You're never going to be able to totally get rid of the fact that the players may decide to turn in a very different direction. But instead of using that as an excuse to say, well, I'm not going to prep anything because who knows what they're going to do. They're totally irrational creatures. I mean, maybe, but there's probably some momentum or something saying, yeah, they're most likely going to do these things. And as you better understand your party and your players, you'll get a better sense of where they're likely to go and then plan ahead, even if you don't end up using it. So I think the important thing here is he's saying, hey, look, yeah, plan ahead, but know that you're just planning for, you're trying to play the odds, right? The odds say they're probably going to do these things, but we know the reality might be very different, but plan for those things anyway. The Dave says a list of friendly and foes sounds useful. It does. And I think writing down the names so you can keep them straight. If you have time, maybe even write in a note about what they want. If you don't have some kind of master NPC sheet, what they want, maybe what their attitude is, towards the party and sort of whether they're on the, potential allies list, whether they're sort of neutral, positive or negative in relation to whatever the party's doing. I mean, that's all good stuff. RJub says in the 1E DMG, it is recommended to create 12 or so patrol groups. Technology has now made it so we do not even need to prep that kind of data with online generators and all. That's true. I still like to use those kind of prep stuff, like the 1E DMG and tables, because I find that when I roll a generator, it doesn't fire my imagination as much as when I run through the tables myself. And the reason is that seeing the options, even if I'm just paging down to find my option, will fire stuff in my brain. Whereas to get that same thing, I have to generally generate a bunch of results in some kind of generator. Because often, because I'm thinking like, well, this one doesn't really fit. This one doesn't fit. This one, it kind of have to go through this thing like, yeah, this is okay. Yeah, this is good. This doesn't work. Yeah, okay, this is good. And I find with the individual tables, I'll have my eyes are hitting all this stuff. So I'm getting all those, even though I'm looking, sure, I'm rolling to get the specific recipe from the tables as they are ingredients, but I get to see all the ingredients as they're going. And for some reason that works better for me. But yeah, all that stuff is good.
Details there. It's just basically me thinking mentally of where the session will begin and where I expect it will end and what do I think will happen in between. And more often than not, I'm proved wrong. Something comes up unexpectedly, but
Right.
That's fine. I've thought about it. And then finally, my last bit of prep is, if necessary, a map. If there's a location that they're going to explore and there's already a map for it, I just need to have that map ready. If it's a new location and I feel like I need a map for it, I'll either create one or I'll go on the internet and find one. So the Dungeon Master is also a storyteller. And what I mean by that is the DM takes care of the setup, and while the player characters are the ones kind of driving the story by their choices and actions, the DM always has to be in lockstep with them and prepared to react to their actions. And
so I think the one I always want to point out here is his definition of storyteller may be different than we think about when we get into internet discussions about storytellers. He is not saying here that the GM is creating a story that the players are following, but what he is saying is that the GM has to react to the players and create the story around them, which makes sense as the party is engaging in stuff like on the holodeck, where the holodeck is the concept of the holodeck is basically that essentially you're sitting in a room that's kind of a big multi-directional conveyor belt, and the room is all in the computer is always generating the stuff that's around you. In the same way, the GM has to continually generate the stuff around the players, and that's kind of how he's defining storyteller. So when you might see this as a bullet point and think, oh, GM is storyteller, no story, which is something I've harped on a lot. As I really get irritated with the GMs who come in saying, I'm a Peabody award-winning writer, and here I'm going to be a storyteller, and you're going to follow my story. In this case, this is a lot more benign, and I think fits right in with the kind of old school approach where we try to emphasize that it's not the GM's story.
Decisions and kind of lead the story along. In some cases, if the story gets stuck or mired, also sort of digging it out of the mud or pointing out the options to the players so they know what the possibilities are. The DM also will, over time, learn a lot about their players and their players' tastes and their players' predilections. And that will inform storytelling down the road. Like if your players tend to be a violent bunch, the DM will plan stories that cater to that type. Whereas if they're more investigative or more into role playing, the DM is shaping the stories in line with what the characters and the players' expectations are.
So this is probably where they diverge a little bit, right? Because usually we think about, well, the players have this open world and they're just going to choose the kinds of things that they want to do instead of me choosing for them. And so this is maybe the first part where I'd say, okay, well, this seems more of a certain style, maybe more that kind of narrative style game. Because yes, in a narrative style game, maybe I want to read the room and say, oh, my players love investigation, so I'm going to put a big investigation in front of them. Whereas in my kind of sandbox open world gaming, I just try to make it so that all these different things are viable. And so the party can simply choose to investigate something versus dungeon delve versus join a war or do whatever. And then I don't have to shape the story. They're going to shape the story. I just make sure that, hey, yes, all this stuff is going to be viable choices for you. You're not gimping yourself. You're not gimping kind of what we're going to be doing here if you choose to investigate or do one thing as opposed to doing another. And that's like in my own personal game, I can attest to that. And that, we started off my game with the kind of more just sort of regular emphasis on dungeon delving, but the players just gravitated towards these other stories, other things going on in the world that were more just on the surface world, with the politics and the kind of movements of the peoples and these other sort of grand events that were happening. So we just pivoted and did that. And I tried not to be, I know the wrinkle I had to work out was doing XP for gold. What happens if they're not grabbing a lot of gold? And that's still kind of an ongoing thing I'm trying to solve better. But ultimately, I just try to make it that, like, yeah, this is absolutely something that I like to play all this stuff, and I'm happy for you to play all this stuff. So you get to choose in the world what you want to do and do it. Whereas, as opposed to me trying to make the world fit the thing you want, if that makes sense. So you end up in the same place. It's just a kind of a different way of thinking about it. RW says, what is so cool about D&D is that it's similar to a good design shop. Everything becomes better when more human brains are included on building the end result or story, in this case. Yep, I would agree with that. And then the Dave says that my brother tells me I should write a book. I keep telling him I'm not a storyteller. I don't have story. I'm a world builder, and I add complications. The players write the story. Yeah, it is very easy to get mixed up in that. And it's going to depend a lot on, your gaming style. But I do wish that the emphasis was shifted more onto players as leaders instead of followers of story, players as the story creators through their actions versus the more passive side of it, which is the players waiting around for the story to happen to them and then acting. I mean, it will probably happen. The game, the pendulum swings back and forth and what people like. And I have to imagine at some point it'll start swinging back in that direction. I mean, in terms of OSR, NSR, and some of the things that already has swung back, but I'm sure the mainstream it'll catch up at some point, and then things will swing the other way again.
But my tip for storytellers is this.
Oh, here we go.
Talk less, listen more. Why?
I'm afraid to ask. I was just instructed to talk less.
Because
Todd,
you
Todd,
do
Todd,
want the players
Todd.
to be invested in the story you're telling. And the more they talk, the more invested they are. But also, as a DM, your players will do a lot of your work for you. If you just listen to their interplay and their discussions, they will fill your head with ideas.
Yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. I've mentioned it a bunch. I've gotten many more great or whatever good ideas from just listening to my players talking back and forth than I have through my own imagination. And I think it's key. I think it's really important. And I think it takes some of that load off, because you can put some kind of enigma in front of your players that you have no idea what it is. And the players will start theorizing. And before you know it, you'll have what it is, because you'll just grab maybe one of their ideas is right on, or you'll take two other ideas and merge them together, or whatever ideas they're talking about will then give you the inspiration to another idea that you love. And also, I think that just letting them be more the focus one, it takes some of the pressure off of you if you're someone who is not comfortable being kind of a speaker in the public speaking sense, where all eyes are on you. Just letting them talk lets you kind of sit back in the background. You don't have to have the spotlight on you the whole time. You can allow the spotlight to be on them, and they're going, and that gives you a lot of time to work and think and figure out what you're going to do next.
They will give you things that you or ways to take the story that you didn't even think of yourself. And being a good listener, you can plan what's going to happen while they're talking.
It is my favorite thing to watch players just spiral, and you just watch it happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's the best feeling as a dungeon master, where you don't actually have to do anything. You just watch it unfold amongst them.
Another trick that I use as part of this talk less and listen more is when I'm setting up a scene and describing the scene, I'll be very, very brief, minimalistic in details. Like, at the end of the road, you see a crumbled down stone vineyard. Full stop. Let the players ask for details. Is there anybody about? Why, yes, you see there's something shambling in the vineyard to the left of the crumbled down building. Then they'll ask me another question, and they'll just keep asking me questions, and I will feed them information, basically only giving them as much description as they need.
So I just want to stop on this one because, man, I think this is a really good one. I'm not saying you have to play this way. I probably don't. I wouldn't say that I'm super brief in my details. It probably depends what you're catching me on, how much I've prepped for that bit of scenery, whatever I'm describing. If I'm just riffing off the top of my head, maybe I'll have had a chance to look up a Google image or do some kind of search, or I have some kind of if I don't have something in my mind already, some kind of inspirational image to kind of keep me going, or whether I've been able to prep up stuff. But one of the things that I have to say, the Critical Role, and I watched a little bit of somebody else, I forget who it was, and that kind of style where they get really super detailed and they're giving you these they're giving you cinematic directions you push in on a man and all this, and it gets really in like that style of describing stuff where it's kind of hyper detailed. I don't actually love it. One, I keep saying this, but I don't love the cinematic language being thrown there, because I think of it more in the kind of imaginative stuff, and all these, like, you're the camera, and you push in on something, just kind of is not helpful to me. It actually pulls me out of it. Maybe it helps some people stay in the moment. I don't know. But I think getting into a habit like this, where you're encouraging your players to be interfacing with the fiction, trying to engage their own senses. If you don't, and I'm not saying don't give sight, sound, smells, all that stuff. You should, I think, if you have them, but getting in the habit where you get in the rhythm where the party's going to be asking questions gets them a lot more actively participating in this moment. And I think what often happens is we always going to have some distance between what we describe as the referee and what's actually in this fiction, right? We're just not going to describe every detail. And sometimes I've seen this kind of argument go back and forth, like, oh, well, they didn't tell me there was this thing here, and I would have done this if I'd known that this was here, or I didn't know this or that, right? Well, and then often that's, well, yes, as the referee, we should be trying to describe the scene kind of as completely as possible. But then there's also other side that says, hey, you as the player, ask a question. You're there, you're not sure. There's a river that's kind of sludgy. You're not sure about it. Before you decide to go take a swim, ask some more questions about the river. You don't have to just take the description and that's it. Ask questions, be inquisitive, say, well, what does it smell like? Does it sound different? Does it look different? Okay, you said sludgy, like, well, sludgy how, right? Ask these questions, and then you get that nice interplay. And by doing that, I think you get players who are going to be more inquisitive before even they've taken actions, which is good. And then, because sometimes as a GM, we just don't even think of all these things. It'd be nice if I had some big list of all these characteristics of this sludgy river that's important, but I might not necessarily have them, or I might not be organized that way. But if you ask me questions, that will get that going, this nice kind of circular, okay, great. And then we're building up this sort of informational data view next to the fictional view, or layered on top of or into the fictional view of the place. And I think getting in that habit of having your players ask questions and sort of encouraging them to do so as opposed to the players waiting for a description, then assuming that it's perfect, and therefore they don't need to interface with it before they start taking actions, is a really good thing. The Dave says they've been known to ask players for their character sheet when the character dies, and when they get it, they rip it in half. There, people are also, folks are reading ahead. All right, let me get to the question here, because I'm talking about what he said before. But the chat is getting into the question here. I think they're going to read it, so I'll let them read it. Here we go.
So, question: what should I do if a character dies? A, cackle with delight. B, tell the character's player to do better next time. C, have snakes erupt from the dead character's corpse.
Yeah.
Or D, discuss options with the dead character's player.
Can it be option A and D at the same time?
Well,
definitely not B.
I'm going to suggest that the correct answer is have snakes erupt from the dead character's corpse.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Could be appropriate.
The real answer is discuss options with the dead character's player.
There is something
Often
to cackling with
occurs,
delight,
it's
though.
unexpected.
Yeah.
It might be the result of bad dice rolls or just a bad decision. And in that case, it's basically spelling the end of a character's journey or a character's arc.
Yeah.
And some players are prepared for that. Some players actually greet their character's death with a fair measure of enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Particularly if they're the type of player who's got like a lineup of other characters that they've built, and they're just aching to play something else.
Holy cow!
Yes.
You know the type.
I'm at 40 minutes, and the
so
video's at
death
13
is not
minutes.
That,
Oh my
doesn't come with
gosh!
any trauma or any resentment or anything like that. But you never know. And so as a DM, it's always good to say, okay, this happened. Take the player aside or just have a conversation and say, do you think your character's journey is over at this point? Are you happy with this situation? Or at least are you ready to move on from that character? Or would you like to discuss other possibilities? In D&D, there is plenty of ways for characters to come back from the dead. And working with your player, you might be able to contrive something fun. Not only the character coming back from the dead, but maybe with a vision that they had while they were dead. Maybe while they were dead, they actually had some sort of weird extraplanar interaction that might propel the character's story even further along. It might be divine intervention or some other encounter. But there are all kinds of ways to skin it. But I think that it's smart for the DM and the player to both agree on the course of action with regards to that character and their journey.
So that's definitely more of a modernism, I guess, right? This idea that kind of death is not the end, that maybe you can come back, maybe you can do something. And look, these aren't bad options, and I would definitely explore them even in my old school game. I've been known to give players kind of devil's bargains of, hey, your character's about to die, but this kind of entity reaches out and says, hey, would you like to keep on living in some form? All you got to do is do this kind of thing for me. So I would be hypocritical if I said, oh, I don't do any of that stuff. But I think the expectation is more in an old school game that, death is on the table, right? And it's coming, and be ready. And because you haven't necessarily invested a ton of time in the character generation part of it, then until you get a few levels on that character, they tend to be a little bit more easy come, easy go. Though, of course, things happen and you become attached to characters even at level 1, depending on what you've written up or just the story that emerges from them playing. And then if you can make it to a few levels in, then some of the options like resurrection and reincarnation do kind of open up to help. But in terms of just generally, right, that's one of those table expectations things that you set, whether it's in session 0 or when it actually happens, or most probably both. When a character dies, just kind of make sure everybody's all right with it and kind of how it happens. I know a lot of people look at that like, oh, like that's so lame, like, whatever, we're hardcore. But look, we're all people, we're all having in different moments of our lives. I think we've all seen it where something that's happened just in life hit somebody differently because they're in a particular spot in their day, in their week, in their month, in their year, just in their life, right? You look at something and go, man, that's not a big deal. And this other person's taking it in a really more serious or stressful or emotional way. So, just be, right? Be mindful, be generous with people, be kind to your fellow humanoid.
So it doesn't feel like it's incomplete
Right. Yeah.
and unsatisfying. Another question, how do I make my players care about my campaign? A, make the campaign about their characters. B, create likable non-player characters and antagonists. C, have the characters' actions come back to haunt them.
Always C.
Or D, avoid predetermined outcomes.
D.
I'd argue it's their campaign, not just yours.
Mm-hmm.
But all of the above. And I've very specifically run into an issue of my villains are so unlikable that they just don't want to be involved with them at all. And that is definitely something I've had happen before. Where, like, you need them to have like something cool about them, or interesting.
Hate them so much they got
yes.
They got go away.
I believe you are correct that all of these are the right answer. If you make the campaign about the characters, the players will have more investment in the campaign. And one of the easy ways to do that is to tie events into their backgrounds or their classes, or their other character choices that they made. You know, if they've defined that they have relationships in the campaign, you know, allowing the campaign to explore those relationships can be very gratifying. The likable non-player characters is also important because even if they're unlikable in terms of their behavior, players will like a good villain, and they will invest more in the world if they care about the people who live there or enjoy spending time in the company of the people who live there. And then,
so I just want to pause on that. I see people are putting in their different votes. Yeah, I mean, gosh, I'm already forgetting what the options were. I think the options were. I think I'm not someone who's a fan of the tying it into backstories, but I think he had a couple options there, right? You could tie it into backstories, other things, and I think when you have a more of a sandbox campaign, the players are actively shaping the campaign as they go, so that's not kind of an issue. It's more if you're planning a more narrative campaign where you kind of have an expectation of the path that the players are going to go, then you have to tune it more. When you're more or less giving the players the world and saying, I'm going to go where you tell me to go, then that becomes less of an issue. I think there is something key about the likable, or at least because it could even apply to villains, right? But I think often you can get, and I've done this, I've fallen this myself at times, where you make people just not unlikable in a cool way, where I'm trying, like Walter Peck in Ghostbusters, he's the FDA, was he work for the FDA? No, not the Food and Drug Administration, whichever he works for, was it the environment? Maybe he works for the EPA. He's the guy in Ghostbusters who shuts down the protection grid and all that stuff. He's a real jerk, but he's a jerk in a fun way where you want to, and he showed up in, I think he's the obnoxious reporter in Die Hard, right? He's a great actor at playing those characters. You want to take him on and push his nose into the dirt and smear it in there a bit. You don't want your NPCs to be just unlikable, where to the point that it's not the kind of fun, villainous, unlikable, or gruff, unlikable, or these kinds of unlikable archetypes that the players want to deal with, where, like, I guess the other Todd, where Watsy Todd says that, hey, his party just wants to go to another town. And I've seen that happen quite a bit, where you go into a town and everybody's just unlikable in a way that you're like, why? We're the plot of what we're trying to do here is save the town, and everybody seems to be, distrustful, and they don't like us, and they're talking down to us and talking a little bit mean to us. And you as the GM are thinking like, oh yeah, this is how the town's going to be. But then the party will earn their respect, and then they'll be nice. But the party's not going to wait around and want to earn their respect, because party's going to be thinking like, these people are turds. Let's just go to the next town. So you want to try to be fun with and this is where you do end up with mustache twirling villains, which I know is kind of a stereotype and a trope, but there's a reason why it is. And that's because if you get that right, it is a lot of fun, and it makes the villains more fun in a villainous kind of way than maybe some other types that show up. Oh, we got some talk here. Yeah, Heroes of Homebrew reminded me it is the EPA. Let's see. And the Dave says, don't go full Joffrey Baratheon. Yeah, he probably kind of went over that line from, who's the other one? Then there was the other one. So Game of Thrones, Joffrey, right? He was the boy king. He was just jerk. But at some point, and this is what happened. You could start off being in that kind of good jerk zone, and then you can leave the good jerk zone and end up in the, this guy's not fun anymore. And there was the other guy. Who was the guy up in the north who was just so awful and just at a certain point, I said, like, this guy's not awful in a fun way. I want to see him get beaten awful. He's awful where I want to leave. I want to leave and do something else and wait for his. This is when I was watching them, live, so it wasn't recorded. I couldn't forward through. Or it's like I'm just going to leave the room until he's finished. I can't remember. He's the one that was mucking about with the Starks. Oh, Ramsay Bolton. Thank you, Magnus. Yeah, it was too much. There was just nothing. No counterbalance. I'm not sure how I would go about fixing that, but yeah, you don't want to go too far into the Ramsay Bolton or the Joffrey Baratheon towards the end kind of thing, because it just gets to be too much. And make sure that your townsfolk and other sort of support NPCs are at least not universally just gruff and mean and depressed and angry all the time.
Having the characters' actions come back to haunt them is important because it creates a verisimilitude of the world. Like their actions.
Verisimilitude. Take a drink.
The characters did something and this thing happened. They may not know the consequences immediately.
Right.
Those consequences might sneak up on them. But what that does is it creates a depth to your world, and it creates that moment of, oh crap, look what we did. We have to fix this because this is a problem we created. And that creates investment. And then avoiding predetermined outcomes. What I mean by that is if your players feel like you're just kind of got them on a railroad to a destination and they can't get off,
right,
then their investment goes down because they realize they actually have no influence over where the campaign is going.
Look at that. Not that I was expecting to say like railroads are great or railroads are the way to go. But, it's nice to hear from him for that 5e audience is, hey, you shouldn't have a path that they can't get off of. Now, I mean, the funny thing is some of their adventures kind of put you on that path, and it can be difficult when you're playing with a pre-generated adventure to add some of those, widen the road, so to speak, or widen the gauge. Is that what they call the railroad? The gauge, the width of the tracks, whatever. But it's nice to know that's not kind of the ideal that he's going for. I mean, stuff he said earlier is also basically amounted to the same thing, but here he kind of says it head on, which is also good. Even if some of their adventures, obviously the ones that probably people don't love, some of them are quite linear.
But a clever DM will guide them to where you want to go while still giving the full, like a range of choice, or at least the illusion of choice, so that players do feel like their action, like they're helping to steer the campaign. And if they have that feeling, they'll be invested. Right.
I wish he hadn't said illusion of choice because that perturbs me, but whatever. Grimlock does point out that he didn't write many of the adventures. No, that's true. I mean, I'm not suggesting he's personally responsible for them, but he's here both as himself and as sort of part of the D&D, or is almost the kind of figurehead of official D&D. So, there is a relationship there, even if he's not personally, responsible. And then he also said, Grimlock also says, Curse of Strahd is his baby, and that one is really open-ended. Yes, and I think I think there's a reason. There are a couple of reasons, right? If we look at that just in terms of what he just said, and you look at Curse of Strahd, what does Curse of Strahd do really well? It's open-ended, has a really good villain. I mean, those are two, and I mean, the setting is I think something that appeals to a lot of people, but I think it's no coincidence that there's a really good dynamic villain that's allowed to be villainous and not just sitting in a throne room somewhere waiting to get ganked. And that it is, as you said, as Grimlock says, it is a very open-ended kind of sandboxy campaign.
Moving on to the Dungeon Master as a referee, a very important role that Dungeon Masters play. My advice to DMs on being a referee is this: the rules serve you, not the other way around.
Oh my gosh. Now I know it's there in the DMG, or maybe I think it's in the DMG, or is it the PHP? It might be in the, because I know that it's probably in the PHP. I don't know, but this is so important. And I'm hoping maybe if Chris Perkins says this and people start to read this, that it might change some of the community. And again, I'm talking about the internet community. I don't know what the wider world community, if I were to go into a gaming shop and just chit chat with D&D folks, I don't know if they're talking about this, but there's been forever, this emphasis on the breaking down analysis, the how do we interpret the rules, but it's never about what the rules are there to do. It's always about, well, is it rules as, shall we go raw, rules as written, or is it rules as intended? But it's almost never the conversation is about rules as intended for the GM, rules as the GM wants them, rules for the table, right? The rules serve you. And I think by you, I know that he's kind of speaking to GMs here, but really it's for the table, for the campaign, for the game, right? You're playing a certain kind of game that we've all agreed to. Do the rules serve this certain kind of campaign and setting that we've all kind of agreed that this is what we're going to play? That's what they never, but the game, the campaign, the setting, all that stuff comes first. The rules come afterwards to support that. And this gets lost so often. And one of the things I'm so thankful for in kind of the OSR, NSR sort of rules light, old school kind of space is that you almost never have these kind of things. Sometimes people will talk about, well, what did Gygax mean by this? Or what did Mentzer or Moldve mean by that? Or isn't it interesting how Dr. Holmes interpreted this? But it's always been about like, well, how do you take these rules and manipulate them to get the kind of game you want, and not you being at service of the rules. And man, I would be happy if I never had to stumble across a rules as written versus rules as intended discussion, but they seem to dominate the 5th edition space, and I'm sure they will dominate the 1 D&D space, or whatever they're calling the new version. And I feel like I wish you could just put this on billboards, just meme this, and just start copy pasting it all around the internet until folks got that message. Oh, we got a bunch of stuff in the chat here. Hold on a minute. Magnus says, rules as the table agrees to run them. Yep. Rules as makes the game fun. Yep. Grimlock says, I got into D&D watching Chris DM for Robot Chicken Riders back in 2008 with 4th edition. Oh, I didn't even, I mean, I know he's been around for a long time, but I didn't know that. R-Dub's 4th edition is the 2nd greatest edition. And then Grimlock asks what the first one is. And then R-Dubs goes from first. So your R-Dubs, your greatest versions of D&D is first and 4th. Wow. The Dave says, everyone says, what did Gary Gygax intend to be? I've never heard someone say, would Ford have made a car like this? I mean, I don't think people really say, what did he intend it to be in terms of like, that's how we should do it. But I think there's always an interesting thing of, well, what was he driving at? And that's really just because the games are so fragmentary. To put it to Dave, if I was going to liken it to a Ford example, it would be like if there were designs for some car that Ford was going to do that maybe he put out there that had missing bits in it. And so you were looking at this schematic of a car or an engine or something, and there's a blank space. And so you're looking at it going, well, I want to build this engine, but there's a blank here, and then trying to theorize, well, what was intended to be in this space? And of course, people would fill in whatever worked for them, as opposed to, I think now, this idea of, now granted, I wish I could say it's for everyone, because there are those people, there are those groups out there, those subgroups of the OSR, for example, the folks that will be up there with their, you have to play 1st edition rules as written kind of brigade, but they're way in the minority. But I'm talking more as people looking at it as like a point of interest, like an interesting historical discussion, like looking at the end of, forget whatever the name of Charles Dickens, that story he wrote towards the end of his life, they never finished and never got finished. So there's an open ending. And so people have adapted the story. Again, I'm forgetting the name, but they've created their own ending. Right. And it's kind of like you're creating, oh, there's a gap here, fill in the gap. And that's, look, people have been fascinated with doing that with, say, OD&D. When you look at all the gaps and you look at chainmail and the stuff, and then you're like, okay, well, some of the chainmail stuff fits into OD&D, but then there's this thing that doesn't really fit either one. What do we do? You come up with something, but it is interesting to think about, well, how did Gary do it? Because I'd like to have that context. It's not necessarily something on a pedestal. It's just trying to fill in a picture, to fill in that gap in the schematic, which is different, I think, than the discussions are in the 5e space, where people are looking for that one true way to play sort of deal, if that makes sense.
And what I mean by that is the rules of D&D exist to as like guideposts. A situation comes up and you don't know how to resolve it, the rules are there to give you a framework to resolve it. But every play group is unique. DMs will often customize their play experience for their particular group. Say you're playing with smaller children who don't know the rules that well, but love the idea of getting into character and going off on an adventure and just like uncovering rocks and looking in tree holes and things like that. A DM can run a version of D&D that sort of pairs a lot of the rules down. Similarly, in just a more typical game, DMs often have house rules that they've introduced because their players have a particular style that they like. Or the DMs decided that the campaign is of a particular genre or style that needs tweaks to the rules. Maybe it's harder to heal, or magic is more rare, or whatever the situation, the rules are there to help you. They don't dictate your campaign.
That's perfect.
So question, hypothetical.
Oh,
The
here we
Goliath
go.
barbarian wants to ride the hostile owlbear. How should I resolve this? A, don't allow it. B, allow a die roll to determine the outcome. C, look up the rules for grappling.
I'm going to say this is one of those
Or
all
D,
answers
ask
questions.
your players for suggestions.
I like B, C, and D. I hate A. I don't want to ever tell players no. I'm amused by a dice roll that goes wrong. The potential there is too much. I also like other players, like, everyone giving their advice on that.
I would argue that all of these are valid.
Oh, okay.
Starting from the bottom and working up, asking your players for suggestions. You may be the DM, but you don't have to know everything. If you don't know how to resolve a situation, players at the table might actually be able to suggest something to you. And if you like it, you can adopt it. If you want to look up the rules for grappling a creature because you think that might actually help resolve the situation, that's actually great. But the rules exist to serve you. You don't have to necessarily know how to resolve the situation, but if you think of something in the rules that might help you, go to that rule and see if it works. Allowing a die roll to determine the outcome is always fine and always acceptable. The dice are great for doing that. And if they roll high enough, you just allow it.
Yeah.
The one that you chafed at
Yes.
is the don't allow it. But I would argue that there are situations where that is the valid way to handle the situation.
Right.
What happens if the Goliath barbarian is unconscious?
Perfect.
Should you allow the player to ride the owlbear?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah.
There are things that can be true in game, situations that might actually prevent that character from doing what they want to do.
Yeah. Like
And
a halfling.
I think that's an interesting point. Now, he's talking about kind of specific situations, but I think picking that kind of, sometimes it's okay to say no, right? Because I'll often see that suggestion, that kind of improv-based suggestions always do yes ands, never no buts. But there are also clearly times, your character's been stunned or something's happened or they're unconscious. So can they ride the owlbear? No, even though the player asked for it, you can't do a yes and. You may be able to say no, but someone could try to throw you on top of the owlbear and tie you to it, and then you could kind of ride it while you're unconscious, right? Something like that. But I think it's important to point out that there are times where it is okay to say, hey, this isn't going to work, and then explain. I always like to think, and I guess the older I'm getting, or I don't know, now I like to kind of talk it out, even if it's a pretty clear answer, because if the player's asking and it's something that is just wildly, something I feel like that's obviously, the answer is obviously no, but they've asked. And so I think, well, the reason why they're asking, or they're saying like, can I do it? Or they're maybe suggesting that they're going to do it. They must see the world differently than I'm presenting it. So I haven't done a great job of presenting things as they are, or they're missing some piece of context, or wherever we're not seeing the same fictional world. So how can I get us back on the same page? And that usually is just having a discussion. And I feel like when we have the discussion and you clarify things, I may realize that I have something wrong, that I may have set up something and I had forgotten about it or whatever. And they remind me, or by talking it through, I'm reminded of something that puts me more in line with their version of it. Or I can get the player to walk towards my version, or it really mostly happens, you meet somewhere in the middle. Like I wasn't looking at something a certain way. And when I talk it out, I recognize some things and the player recognizes some things, and you hit that synthesis point where it's like, okay, now we're back to this shared version of the world and we can kind of make it work. Hey, Frederick's here. Frederick says first edition plus Beckme is where it's at.
With 5 strength.
Not a huge Beckme fan. I would say
that might be a
OD&D
long shot. It might have a high CR, but if there's
with
a
some
wall
extras,
of force between the
this kinda
halfling and the
would be my
owlbear, then yes, there's
favorite, I
no
think.
realistic way.
Finally got me on one.
Yes.
I thought you were messing with me by giving me 3 positives and 1 negative. I have failed.
All right. Another question. Well, okay. What if the owlbear is friendly instead?
Okay.
A, allow the barbarian to succeed automatically. B, require a successful ability check against
I think this is another,
easy
every answer is appropriate.
C, Same as B, but with a higher DC, because riding an owlbear should never be easy. Or D, trick question, owlbears are never friendly.
Well, that in itself is a trick question. It's still all of them. Because, well, there are friendly owlbears, probably. I think I've witnessed you make an owlbear friendlier
Hashtag
than
not
they
all
are
owlbears.
potentially designed to be.
Yeah.
People are very attached to owlbears, despite the fact that most
True.
of them want to rip your face off.
Yeah, true. I would argue that all of these are acceptable answers. You can allow the barbarians to succeed automatically. You can require an ability check at a low DC or at a higher DC. And you may decide, in your world, owlbears are never friendly.
Yeah.
Yeah. As the DM, you get to make that call. Now, replace owlbear with, kraken or dragon or whatever monster you want. You will eventually come to a monster for which the answer is, well, you know what? You're never going to find a friendly gray ooze.
As Magnus points out, owlbears are never friendly. It's fine if you establish that rule for the world. I mean, and I think I get what Magnus is saying in that. So here's what I'll say: you as a GM should not expect yourself to come up with all the world rules for all the creatures from jump. I don't expect you to go through your monster manual and have a note from creation of your world that owlbears are never friendly. You may wait. I know I would until I actually rolled up an encounter or decided to have an encounter with an owlbear in there to even start thinking about what are owlbears really like in my world in terms of those kind of details. But what I would say is that you should not say that owlbears are unfriendly just because you don't want to deal with the action that's been suggested. If you're going to say, hey, no owlbears are friendly, they're all unfriendly in the world, hey, that's totally fine. But then that should be that's because how they are. And that's how you think that they should be. Not because in the moment you, for whatever reason, don't want to honor the action of that player. Like, I don't want to deal with this tonight, so owlbears are unfriendly. That's the wrong way to think about it. And if you're kind of that sort of mental space, then take a break, end the game early, do something else. But you want to make decisions for the right reasons. Even though you might get to the same outcome, which is owlbears are unfriendly, you want to do it because that's how you want them in your world and not because you are anti a particular course of action for whatever reason. Ian says Flea Mortals definitely has rules for owlbear mounts. All right, cool. I haven't looked at Free Mortals, but I've heard good things about it.
Right. Oh,
in my campaign.
Well, now I want a friendly gray ooze.
Yeah. Another question. One player is hogging the spotlight.
Uh-oh.
What should I do? A, after the game, have a private chat with that player. B, make it clear when you're shining the spotlight on other players.
Or when they have
C,
the spotlight.
Ensure every player character has moments to shine.
Potentially.
D, dump that player if they're spoiling everyone else's fun.
As a last
so
resort.
It's definitely potentially all of them because, and I really like what you mentioned about letting people know when the spotlight is on them and establishing that. But yeah, it's definitely become a problem at tables I've been at before where you kind of have this first character syndrome that occurs, or only character syndrome, and other characters, other players may not be accustomed to giving themselves the spotlight. Like some people are just either they're playing a character who is quieter and more subtle, or they themselves are a quieter person that needs that spotlight on them and have that opportunity to talk up.
Yeah, I think my note here is I'm not big on creating situations. I know this is something that a lot of the modern GMs will do, is say they're going to create situations. I'm going to create a situation for the bard. They're going to create a situation for the thief. Then I'm going to create a situation for the fighter. And I'm not doing any of that. And part of playing in that sandbox means that because I'm not generating situations like that in a linear way where I can determine that next up is the thief, then the bard, then the thief, then the fighter. I can't do that. But what I can do is within a particular scenario, make sure I'm asking these different players what they're doing, because what can happen is that first player syndrome or the whatever you want to call it. I think there's some other names for it. I can't remember, but that what often will happen is that first player will speak up and then the GM will start riffing off of that player's actions and everyone else just ends up following along. Right. You know, you enter the room and then the fighter goes, I do this thing. And then the GM just starts to riff over what the fighter's doing. Before you know it, the whole party's been carried along on some path that just because you had that player who speaks quickly and authoritatively maybe, or just starts the ball rolling with actions, can just end up just running things in a certain way. Well, as a GM, you don't have to let that happen. The fighter goes, I'm going to pick up this chair and throw it. Okay. You get GM, all right, fighter's picking up that chair. Wizard, you're over there. You see the fighter reaching for the chair. What do you do? Okay, thief, you're over there. You see what those guys doing. What do? Run around the room and get that input, and don't allow as much as possible one player. Yeah, that player may be talking up first, but you don't necessarily allow them to take over. The other thing you do is, for those situations where timing is important and somebody keeps jumping ahead, use initiative. I know that a lot of times folks just use initiative for combat. I use it for all sorts of things. And I use it, I'll tell my players, I'm going to have you roll for initiative, not because you're fighting necessarily, but because timing is important. And if you have somebody who's consistently jumping, trying to get to the front of the queue by talking fast to get something started, have everybody roll initiative. They're going to win sometimes. And then, they're going to get to jump start. They're going to do, but they're going to have some other times they're going to roll. They're going to come up last. And then everyone else is going to go. And then also prompts you to go through each of these initiative points. Say, okay, now you. Oh, then fighter, what you want? And then the fighter's like, well, I was going to pick up the chair, but you guys have already kind of solved the situation for it. So now something else is going to happen. So, something to keep in mind.
All of these are viable options. Having the private chat with the player, just to let them know that there's an issue, is great. Making it clear when you're shining the spotlight during the game, like for instance, Todd, if you're hogging the spotlight,
I do not hog the spotlight, Chris.
Gary or Julia to
do not besmirch me,
to chime in, then I will simply say, Julia, it's your turn. What does your character do? And that's a signal to Todd to, not talk, because I'm having a one-on-one conversation with Julia or Gary or whoever. And then ensuring every character's moments to shine, as you say, is very key, because players will eventually get into the pattern of realizing what you're doing and realize, oh, okay, this is so-and-so's character moment here. I'm just going to shut up for a bit. In the extreme example, if nothing else is working out, dumping the player is always an option. You can have friends who are not fun to play D&D with.
Yes.
Just because of behaviors and people getting wrapped up in the excitement. They're not always behaving the way they would normally. And so sometimes it just doesn't work out, and that's fine.
Yeah, good point to bring up, right? You got to have lots of friends, and I know that becomes really fraught. I see a lot of times questions about what to do with problem players, and they're almost always prefaced by, these players are all great friends of mine, or it's my brother, it's my roommate, it's my dad, my uncle, somebody like that. And it is difficult, but they could still be your friends, your dad, your uncle, your roommate, whatever, and they don't have to be your D&D buddies. Now, I know that can be difficult, but sometimes that is the best, because having someone who is disruptive to everybody else might just destroy the whole game. And then, and then everybody loses out.
Yeah, there's a chemistry to every group.
Yes. There's every group has a bit of alchemy to it, and when you combine personalities, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen.
Right.
So we come to the intermission here, and
we get an intermission.
On this particular slide are 6 images. One of them is not an official D&D book cover.
I'm going to try to.
Which one?
I'm not going to try to.
If you guessed the
navigate.
One in the top middle, you are right. Yes, maybe it was the art style that gave it away. I don't know. But
I do like that.
This gelatinous cube has not appeared on an official 5th edition book cover before. But the reason I drew this image to your attention is just to sort of create a little break point in the middle of this presentation. I am here to issue the gelatinous cube challenge.
Ooh, what's the gelatinous cube challenge?
So, a gelatinous cube is an iconic D&D monster that dates back all the way to the origins of the game. It is cube-shaped, it is gelatinous, it haunts dungeons, it often sort of sweeps up debris as it makes its way through 10 by 10 corridors. It's in the dark, very hard to see. In fact, many adventurers end up just walking into one, not aware that it's right in front of them. And sometimes it sneaks up on adventurers from behind and engulfs them. And that's bad, because gelatinous cubes have acidic enzymes that will dissolve flesh. So this fun, not particularly intelligent monster gets a lot of.
I didn't realize it was enzymes.
Here's my challenge.
Oddly specific.
Everywhere. right now, try to think of the most interesting or unusual use of a gelatinous cube.
All right, chat. What is your most
Maybe it's one that
original
you've actually experienced before,
unusual
used
use of a
before,
gelatinous
or
cube?
maybe it's
Go.
one that an idea that you're just pulling out of the sky right now.
Hey, RPG Grandma, is that where
So I'm gonna go with
gelatinous cubes came
gelatinous
from?
cube
Greyhawk Supplement
with
1?
a vampire in the middle that is stuck. It has lived who knows how many years inside of this gelatinous cube that has been feeding on it for maybe 100 years, but it keeps on regenerating over and over again. So this kind of withered husk of a vampire is in the center of the gelatinous cube.
RPG Grandma
constantly
has
feeding it.
sci-fi
So
gelatinous
cube is in the
cubes
dungeon,
cleaning spaceship
and
hulls.
they
That's
have
cool.
to face off with this horrible undead ooze-like conglomeration.
What might be fun about that encounter is that when you kill the ooze, it basically frees the vampire that can then start regenerating normally, and suddenly you're fighting this second monster. That's super fun. The other
A
thing
war machine that only runs on
is the
gelatinous
visual
cubes. Oh, that's
going
interesting.
down the dark corridor and seeing this husk of a vampire floating toward you.
Grimlock had a gelatinous
not
cube as a
realizing it's
compost
not
bin.
actually
I like that.
floating,
I've done that
it's
before.
suspended
I've
in
seen that
the
before, like
cube.
as a garbage kind
And
of
if you
shoot
run up
sort
to
of
fight
thing.
it, blorp, you're going to run right into the cube.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'll share one idea of my own, and that is kind of similar to yours. Only in this case, the gelatinous cube absorbed and dissolved a master thief who happened to be the head of a thieves' guild. And rather than simply being dissolved, the thief's consciousness became one with the cube. And now the cube believes it is the master thief and is leading the thieves' guild.
That's kind of awesome. I'll give some credit where credit's due. A master thief gelatinous cube.
Right?
Right? Like
Yes.
what the
An
that's-
infrastructure is just
sneaky
That's
gelatinous
good, Chris.
cube.
You got me
Yes.
on that
Who
one.
knows how to dispose of anybody who, tries to
Literally.
rise to its position. Exactly.
it's
Another-
like being the pig farm and also the pig.
Oh, yes.
Where bodies
Yes.
are dumped.
Right?
Spoiler alert,
Yes.
folks. Stay away from a pig farm.
Another fun use of a gelatinous cube would be, let's say you're going into a dungeon to retrieve an artifact or an item.
Right.
Wouldn't it be fun to put the item inside the gelatinous cube so it was always moving around the dungeon and never in the same place twice?
Using detection on that would
Yes.
drive. Yeah, that's great.
Here's a third one. You've probably heard of the gelatinous cube hiding out in the bottom of a pit, right? So
Yeah,
the character
sure.
falls into the pit, goes borp into it.
Of course.
Well, how about the ceiling pit? The characters walk along, the pit opens in the ceiling, and the gelatinous cube just drops on top of somebody.
Perfect. I love it.
All right. Well, we need to move on back to our regularly
Yes, we
scheduled
do, Chris.
presentation.
Goodness,
think
you're at
about
30
gelatinous
minutes and I'm at
cubes.
an hour
I do
20.
constantly.
Okay. Good for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Another role that the DM has is as an actor. The DM is
An
responsible for
actor.
playing all of the background and supporting characters in the campaign, including the monsters, by and large. My tip is start by understanding a creature's motivation.
And just a note, this is good whether you're actually acting them out or just having them somewhere. Understand their motivation is good. Giving them a motivation. Actually, I'll start this. Give them a motivation, which is more than just either killing adventurers or standing there to be killed by adventurers, assuming they're hostile, and then understanding it. So maybe acting tip 0, allow them to have a motivation and then understand it.
If you always know what a creature wants, it becomes much easier to role play that creature and bring it to life.
Right.
So my question is, how do I play a Galeb Dur, which is basically a talking boulder?
Right.
Just by way of example. A, lean into expectations, i.e. use a deep, gravelly voice. B, defy expectations. Give it the personality of a, say, rock star. Rock star, you get it?
Oh boy, Chris.
C, check its intelligence score and its alignment. Or D, think like a rock, become the rock.
Oh,
All of them. And yeah, I wish I could become a rock sometimes. That would be fantastic. They seem very peaceful.
Interesting. Now, I would argue that the first 3 are all great. Leaning into expectations is good because it's easy. You don't have to think too hard about it. Yeah, rocks probably have a gravelly voice. Okay, I can pull that off, and your players will get it.
Gravel is in the
Yeah.
word. Yeah.
if the Gaelder talked in a high squeaky voice, the players might go, they might go, what's that? Gravelly voice expected. But I always think it's nice when acting out a creature to find a way to defy expectations, to give it a personality that will stand out or stand apart. And it could be any one of a number of different things, from just a quirk that it has, to a manner of speaking that is unusual, to a personality that seems to be a little unexpected for the type of creature that you're encountering. But all that aside, a creature's stat block often has cues or clues in it that can help you role play or act out that creature. One of them is its intelligence score. Mm-hmm. If you see a creature with a low intelligence, that can affect very easily how you play that creature. And alignment is another good cue. We don't prescribe.
But Chris, you guys are getting rid of alignment.
In D&D,
what will you do?
An alignment for everyone. So if you've got a devil and its alignment is typically lawful evil tells you something about its personality. It's kind of a tyrant. It's probably domineering, that kind of thing. Now, think like a rock, become the rock sounds like something a high school drama teacher might urge you to do. Now, while I ruled that out,
yes,
as being practical, I have been challenged on this one before.
Right.
If you actually sort of physically get into a hunkered down position like a rock, you sort of expand your chest maybe a little.
Yeah.
That could affect your performance acting. So maybe becoming the rock is actually a viable thing after all.
Perfect.
The DM is also a director. But what I mean by director, as opposed to
you didn't say, hold on a minute. Well, I guess he's going to explain it, because I think this is kind of key too. Or they'll bring up the slide again.
Needs to keep the story moving and know when things are getting bogged down, and then kind of reorient the invisible camera, as it were. Mm-hmm. And the director has to know where to shine the camera at any given time. So my tip is, let your players help steer the adventure, but when the fun is gone, move on.
Right. Yeah, there's probably a lot of ways to interpret that. I don't love again, as I keep saying, I don't love the using the cinematic terms, but I think there are some truths here, even if you don't want to use it. As things can get bogged down in minutia, where people are getting frustrated or just nothing's happening. And oftentimes, usually, almost always, the GM's not part of that. It's usually the players in amongst themselves doing something. And because you're outside that particular dynamic, you can see it happening. And you therefore are in a position to say, like, oh, okay, let's, you guys got what you're looking for or whatever. Let's, move on. Or, the old classic orcs attack, something happens, kind of push things forward and just kind of get out of that. Everyone's kind of spinning their wheels in a really not fun, not productive kind of way. And I think there's a good point about when the fun is gone, move on, move right on, or move on. When the fun is gone, move on. I definitely think in terms of when people look at combat, and this is why I like to really lean in on morale and reactions and all these things, is because particularly with combat, particularly when you're playing in systems that can be very deadly, if everybody's fighting to the death, it makes a lot of combats into slogs that don't need to be. And there's nothing worse than a fight that's essentially all but decided, but the GM won't decide it. They're going to keep making you slug it out. And then something really bad can happen to you, your character, and it does nothing to do. It doesn't change the course of the combat, but it's like, okay, great. Now I'm all messed up, or I'm dead, or now I'm unconscious. And this is really just because the GM just kept making us play through it. And that kind of frustration, that kind of annoyance, as well as just attacking on all the extra time that you're going in, when clearly people have run out of interesting choices to make. Clearly everybody can see the writing on the wall. It's like, okay, we've got this thing cornered, we got this thing surrounded. It's still going to be 5 turns until we kill it. If it's intelligent, maybe have it surrender, maybe have it plead for its life, maybe have it try to run away, maybe even have it make some kind of one last attack, but then whatever happens, it's gonna die making that attack. If it's a creature, maybe it just gives up, maybe you just kill it. There's very little reason to just play out the string when it is really decided. And as much as we say, oh well, the dice, you never know. It's like, no, sometimes sometimes you just you could see the writing on the wall. Everybody could see the writing on the wall. And it's at those times when I'm looking at the GM going like, man, we can all see what's going to happen here. Are you really going to make us do this for another 30 minutes where we're just going to keep saying we're doing what we're doing? Or can you just put this thing out of its misery, put this moment out of its misery and allow us to progress and move forward? Hey, Kelly James, how are you? RPG Grandma says, rumble, rumble goes the rock carpet. There you go. And then Dave says, when in doubt, attack. For sure.
One practical way I do this is, let's say I have my session planned. There's a destination in mind or a conflict brewing or something that's about to happen, and my players are dragging their heels in, or they're tangled up in a discussion that isn't going anywhere, or they're just content to hang out in town and are actively sort of not striving to go where they know they need to go. One of the things I do is I will just fast forward. So they're lagging around in the town, they're dickering with their shopping, they're arguing about this, that, and the other thing. I'll just say, the next day you're on the road heading to the dungeon. And they're like, okay. We've just been sort of re-centralized and the DM has basically pulled us into the future. That is a great way to get the action moving again, because you've just essentially jump skipped or edited out a bunch of stuff to get back to the story at hand. Now, I know some players of mine will sort of go, whoa, okay, we're on the road, but can I just go back to the town for a quick second, or just flash back to buying some carrots for our mule, Charlie?
Yeah.
And I'll go, yeah, you got the carrots. Now you're on the road heading to the, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just basically cut the movie and then jump to the next scene.
All right, so R-Dub says that they so disagree with that. So which thing, R-Dub, are you disagreeing with what Chris is saying, or is there something in the chat that I missed? Magnus says, night on the town play can be fun, usually after a big adventure arc. Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about what you make of the situation, but I have definitely seen it. It's happened with my players where they will just get into like kind of a nothing. And I think when you do what he's suggesting or something like it, basically where you're saying like, okay, we're moving on, right? Even sometimes they'll say like, all right, like we finished, even like sometimes I might say, can we just finish the shop? Are you done with the shopping yet? Are we ready to move on? And just something to prompt them to like, hey, wrap it up or make decisions. Because it's fine if they're doing stuff and it has a fictional import and it's doing things and everyone's kind of enjoying it. But there's other times where it's not even in fiction stuff. It's like out of character, just kind of mumbling, grumbling discussions, blah, 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 back and forth. And whether it's kind of analysis paralysis type stuff where it's just indecision. And sure, you could sit there and allow it to play out forever. But sometimes it's good to say like, all right, man, we're cutting it off. I mean, this is the same thing in combat. Same thing. You're dithering on your turn. A lot of games I'll play and I haven't had to break it out, but get that sand timer out. Just click on the sand timer. It's like, all right, man, you got until the SAMs. We'd call it the SAMs. We'd call it the sands of time. Right? All right, the sands of time are on, dude. Figure it out, right? And then you would see how fast people's actions would crystallize when the sands of time are on. And then sometimes, you run out of the sands and then being like, all right, man, I'm moving on. You'll come back to you now and then get ready. I see there's some chat about carousing, but I don't know. They haven't mentioned carousing, so I'm not sure. But I'm going to go ahead. You guys keep talking about carousing. I think I must have missed something in the chat. I'm going to move on.
Perfect.
Question. My characters don't want to complete the quest laid out before them. What should I do? A, provide additional motivation. B, surface a more tempting quest. C, let the players direct the story for a while. Just sit back, whatever. D, tell the players you have nothing else prepared.
I mean, all of the above potentially. If you're not into improv and this is the only thing that you've got left there at the end, I think that's a very fair thing to say. Like, you were not prepared for another avenue, but I do like the chaos of players sometimes, subverting that adventure if they're not into it and finding their own way.
You are correct. All of these
Another all the above. You're getting into a little bit of a rut.
Providing an additional motivation
questions,
can
Chris.
help. Like if they're going on a treasure hunt and the paladin's like, well, I'm not all about treasure. That's not really my bag. You can contrive something that would hook the paladin in. maybe there's some noble thing that can be accomplished with the treasure, or there's some other thing at the destination that the paladin might glom onto as being important enough for them to go on the adventure. You can surface a more tempting quest. It's okay if the players are really resistant to going in a direction and saying, okay, that's not working.
Right.
I'm going to save that for later and see if I can maybe get them back there at a later time and instead try something else.
So Magnus says, or let me go. Brian Smith said they've yet to bust out the sand timer on their group since we've been playing remote. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't need it. I mean, I think the goal is you don't need it, you know. And I'm not someone who would say with the sand timer, right? That as soon as it's like your turn, turn the sand timer on. The rule was when the game that I was playing that we used it a lot was you had some amount of time to get your thoughts together, but there was then when you've kind of run out of, or everyone kind of run out of patience, a couple minutes of you just still don't know, then the sand timer would come out. So really, if it was like, I don't know what our sand timer was. It might have been a minute sand timer. It was more like after 4 or 5 minutes, then you'd get the sand timer. So you kind of had, you probably had between 5 and 7 minutes. We weren't using stopwatches to count all this stuff. So you were good. And in terms of Magnus talking about carousing, no, that's all good. I think what he's talking about, what I'd be talking about is not stuff. The carousing stuff is fun. And as long as you're moving things forward, right? The world, and you're getting in the world, you're doing stuff. But I think we have all been in games where you're sitting around and like an hour's passed and you're looking around going like, we have done nothing. It's not even that I'm not even talking nothing like the world hasn't changed, but it's like we've literally done nothing. We started off an hour ago, we were sitting in the tavern talking about what we were going to do next. And then an hour later, we're still in the tavern and we can't even say that our talk has really progressed that much, right? That kind of thing where like literally zero has happened. And you as a GM and you and your groups are all going to have different ideas of what something is. If you're very character driven, then maybe that discussing part in character, assuming it is in character, is enough. And that is all the kind of stuff you need. That's great. But of course, it's up to your table who might be saying like, we just spent an hour doing kind of out of character discussions that have been doing nothing. And at that point, in those times, I think when the progress as your table sees it, or just being productive, however your table defines it, isn't happening, where maybe, as a GM who's, again, usually outside of this, though not always, can be like using some methods to kind of like get things moving. Let's see. Daniel Lambert said, this happened to me last week. We had some tasks, role-playing, carousing, and they still just sat around not making decisions. I finally had to ask them to do it through their role play. What are your goals going forward? Okay, do one of those. Yeah, sometimes you do have to remind folks like, hey, aren't you you guys are back in town to do something, right? Like, and you guys haven't done any of it and you're not doing anything else either. So don't you want to do that thing? And I think that's where it's just like, it's okay. It's almost like giving you permission. It's okay as a GM to kind of nudge things forward. But again, it's how you define productivity or what progress, whatever is going to be totally you and your table. It doesn't have to look one way or another way, right? It's all what it looks to you.
But like you say, you have to be pretty comfortable with improv to embrace that. And you also have to be comfortable with improv if you let the players basically take the reins for a while.
Yeah.
And so saying, look, guys, I have nothing else prepared. This is what we ought to do. Totally cool. In D&D is a game and everybody's supposed to have fun. And there is a social contract that underlies the game. The social contract being the DM will put on a good show and the players will respect the work that the DM has done to do that, and they will respect each other. Everyone will respect each other. That's the social contract. If the players are basically rebuffing what the DM has prepared, they're kind of breaking the social contract at that point. And it's okay for the DM to say, look, guys, the adventure's that way. Mm-hmm. Big sign pointed in that direction.
I think it's probably good to point out that this is what you want to cover at the beginning of your game, right? What kind of game are we playing? And that will help define that social contract. In a sandbox game, I'm totally fine if the players want to do, as Brian Smith said, goof around town. I'm usually okay with that. But it's funny, there have been times where I've let the players goof around all night, and then they're upset at the end of the session that they didn't get anything done. And, I usually will say like, well, you guys were doing this other thing. But I wonder if they wouldn't appreciate it, even though they understand that it's really on them, if I didn't maybe take a stronger hand in saying like, hey, didn't we want to do this thing tonight? Right. And so sometimes I'll say like, hey man, this is all fun if you guys want to keep doing this kind of goof stuff, but just know that we've got an hour and a half left. If you guys want to get to this thing tonight and get to maybe more interesting or exciting or whatever things, then you probably want to start working on that. Right. Ultimately, there's no wrong way to do it. But I like pointing out that social contract. But there isn't one social contract for every game. This is something that he doesn't. I don't think he's going to probably talk about session 0 or pitching your campaign or anything like that. But that's something you want to set up. Get everybody on the same page with the expectations for your campaign and your table, your game, and one of those is laying out exactly what that social contract is.
And that's totally
RPG Grandma does not like the term social contract. It's all right. It's all right. There are other terms, but whatever.
A, jump ahead, skipping events of little consequence. B, collapse a string of unimportant events into a montage. C, have someone kick down the door. D, play fast music in the background.
I wish they'd put these slides on longer.
Yes, you're correct.
Music is a great motivator, but also talking about prep. I have over prepped many a time where I've had too many beats in the adventure, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to delete this because we are running out of time. It's happened more that way than the other way. I have very rarely had to actually create more content for the story, where mostly I've just had to delete entire like NPCs or opportunities or things they had to come up against just for the pacing of that adventure.
Yes, absolutely. I've done the exact same thing. I've also had some villain from the past who's been absent for several sessions just show up out of nowhere, literally kick down the door and say, "It's fighting time!"
Man, I like that. I'm gonna have to do that.
That's a perfectly viable option, and it gets a game going. Right,
put that on my random encounter list.
Right away again.
BBEG shows up.
Playing fast music. I'm not
yells its clobber in time and just starts hitting people.
But there is, if you are a DM who does use background music in the game,
right,
switching to a track that has a faster pace, can subliminally get the character or the player's juices.
That's interesting about the music. I had not thought about that.
And anticipating moving on.
Or just use Benny Hill music.
Moving on,
I forget the name of the actual Benny Hill song, but everybody seems to know it as the Benny Hill tune.
This often comes up if you got players in the group who don't have a lot of experience with the game. The Dungeon Master is often the one who's thrust into the role of teacher at the table. My tip is explain how the D20 is used, then start playing.
So I just want to pause here. I missed. Oh, kind of got it. Okay. One of the things that I think makes old school gaming more difficult. People will often have discussions, right, over what's easier, someone to learn BX or OD&D or first edition, BECME, whatever, or fifth edition. And I haven't had this experience myself, but I've had enough people who seem to have backgrounds in teaching games tell me that I trust, I believe them, that fifth edition is in fact easier to teach. And this is the reason, because ultimately, because fifth edition uses one unified mechanic, all you have to do to get somebody at least started is teach them how to use that mechanic. Explain how the D20 is used, then you can start playing. If I'm playing BX, yes, I can tell them how the D20 is used, but depending on what comes up next, they might be rolling some other die that I have to also explain how it's used. And sometimes I have to explain that sometimes you have to roll the D20 and you want high, other times you have to roll the D20 you want low. There's all these different variations. And I think we often look at those things usually through some kind of lens, a little bit rose-colored with nostalgia, as, oh, I love the way there are all these different systems, all these different dice. But I think it's just, I think this is why games like, and I don't know if Shadow Dark does this, but I presume the games that like Shadow Dark, like other, like maybe against, what was the other game that was like, not 4 Against the Darkness, but some of those other kind of OSR 5e mixes. One of the things I think that really does help teaching is that by using a unified mechanic, you just have to explain this one thing. And granted, they're all going to be kind of, different modifiers and how they interact with each other, different actions, all blah, blah, blah. But that one mechanic always works the same. And I don't think there's I have no doubt that this is true. But people, even though people don't maybe want to hear it, but it is.
To walk the players through all the sort of elements of what makes a D&D game. Like, here's your character sheet. Here's your hit points. This is your armor class. This is what it means. Here are your weapons, and here's how much damage they do. Here are all your abilities, blah, 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 your spells, blah, 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 blah. It's been my experience with new players that the sooner you get them actually playing, the better. And a lot of the rules or things on their character sheet can be discussed when they become relevant. For instance, a player doesn't need to know anything about hit points. until combat happens and something hits them, or until they fall off a cliff and they take
And they
damage.
die.
That's
No.
a great time to talk about what hit points are and what they mean in the game and how you keep track of
Here are
them.
your hit points.
You don't have
They're
to
all
worry
gone
about
now and you're
good
dead.
information
But this is what they were.
What you really want to burden the player with is just get their imagination going right away. It's good to know what the D20 does, however, because it is so manifestly important to most players at various points in the game for various reasons to pick up that D20 and roll it. So knowing that high is good, low is bad, is just, as a player, they can internalize that right away, and then they can start getting into character.
That's perfect.
Question. One of my players has trouble deciding what their character should do
Egg
on
timer.
their turn in combat. How do I get them to play faster?
B is underrated.
A, use an egg timer, skipping the player if they aren't fast enough.
He laughs, but we've done that. That works.
Yeah.
B, signal your exasperation by rolling your eyes and sighing loudly.
Awesome. That's a great way.
C, suggest one or two good options. Or D, make the initiative order visible to your players.
Isn't it always visible
I
to the
think
players'
the
initiative?
order is really good to see for a lot of folks. Providing options once it's ground to a halt. Not a fan of the other ones. Rolling your eyes, come on.
Yes, the first two options are not great.
Yeah.
I don't think you want to put added pressure of a timer on the players and on the player in that moment, because they'll just freeze.
Yeah.
B, rolling your eyes, that's not good. That's
No.
Yeah.
Just a jerk.
You're just a jerk.
Come on, amongst Frez, giving a good,
Suggesting
like,
one or
you're
two
killing me
options is
smells.
often great.
Underrated.
Just a reminder. Oh, by the way, you have cantrips. You can just do those. Or
Yeah.
you haven't used your fireball.
Got to be
yet.
careful with
Yeah.
C, though. You
That
don't
kind of
want
thing.
to end up being something
Little
where you're
prompts
kind of
that help a DM
telling the party,
or help
your
a player
players, individual players,
narrow
what to do.
down the possibilities and come to a decision. And making the initiative order
Don't be a
visible
backseat player.
is helpful, because if the players can see it, they know when their turn is coming up, and they can start thinking about what their character is doing before their turn.
Oh, you'd
actually
like to think
arrives.
they do that, but
Finally, one of
No.
the biggest roles of a dungeon master, and one of the hardest, is the DM is improviser. Improv is basically mental gymnastics.
Yeah.
It's what a DM is basically doing all the time, while they're doing everything, all those other roles, they are also improvising all the time. And it can be very exhausting to keep up with several players. Each of them are doing things that are not planned. It can be taxing and it can be difficult, and it requires exercise and practice, which is why my tip is, hey, improv gets easier the more you play. And until then, embrace the unexpected.
Right.
Often.
yeah, I mean, I think this is a good tip. Improv does get easier the more you play. I think, yes, you should also embrace the unexpected. And I think the other thing is don't take a moment for yourself. Like, the party often will get the plan. They'll get to take a timeout somewhere. I usually give a lot of latitude, especially when I'm playing in my small game or I'm running a small game, only 2 players. Sometimes you'll get in a situation where you're playing and the player, the players, and you're talking, and the GM will say, like, hey, you guys are taking too long. So I'm going to say that now everything you're saying is in character. So basically you're RPing, which means that time is passing, right? All this stuff. With my 2 players, I don't do that. I allow them to play and discuss. I think by the same token, if you have to say, I need a minute, I need a timeout, throw the yellow flag or white flag and say, hey, I need a timeout. I need to check some tables. I need to go do whatever. I just need a moment. If you want to camouflage, just say, like, okay, can we take a quick bathroom break, drink break, smoke break, whatever break, and then think about it, do that. I think part of what makes the improv hard for newer GMs is they feel like they're stuck in that moment and they have to make that decision in the moment. And all the eyes are on them and they're stuck. And if you are stuck, instead of making a rash decision one way or another, take that minute. And if you are looking at it and, okay, you've played and it looks like, oh, I only have 15 minutes left in the session and I'm stuck, you can always say, like, hey, we're going to cover that next week. Hey, we're going to end early. What a great point. Like, we'll cover it, right? Don't be afraid to do that either. Help yourself stay out of that pressure box if you can. That's right. The Dave says the dog needs to go outside break. The being willing to call a break. Bang that says I've heard GMs making loading screen cards that they put on their screen while they reference a rule or prepare something. Yep. And this is why I often will let my players go at length to discuss, because that's often when they're talking amongst themselves, besides just listening to them and getting all that great suggestion and that great inspiration and ideas, it's also time for me to catch up to maybe what they're doing. So that's also another like little hidden tip. Allow your players to keep yapping, because then that gives you a chance to catch up. Brian Smith says that awareness and self-control is hard for me. You get wrapped up in the moment and want to give an answer to something when all eyes are on you. Yeah, I hear you. You got to kind of, it is something you got to kind of teach yourself, learn. But yeah, I don't know. I wish there was some way you could to trigger that self-awareness of like, oh, I'm about to say something I'm going to regret, so let me stop. But yeah, you kind of got to, maybe you have some of those mistakes or things where you're like, oh, I really did something stupid, or I gave something away, or I don't know, whatever you did that you didn't really want to do. And then maybe that helps. But yeah, it is something you have to learn. And you just like Mr. Perkins says, you just got to keep playing and doing, and it'll get easier.
And DMs will use a technique called yes and, where player says, I want to do this wacky thing. The DM says yes, and here's what you have to do, or here's potentially where this might go, that kind of thing. Another option is like, no, but you can't do this, but you can maybe do this other thing, or you can try it, but it's going to be really, really hard. Another technique for DMs is what my colleague Mackenzie DeArmas calls embracing the loading wheel.
Okay.
Which is, while it's true that improv gets easier the more you play, and that it's good that until then you embrace the unexpected, you as a DM also have license to pause.
Well, look at that. Great minds think alike. And I just wanted to pause right here because the Dave has also a great suggestion, which is put up a Post-it note that says, be self-aware in front of you as a reminder. Yeah, I think that's good. Anything you can put up, Post-it notes, if you're playing remotely, you have a monitor, stick some notes around your monitor, put some on your DM screen with some things that you want to remember. And one of those is, pause, take a breath, take a 2-minute break. All those things, check the time. I mean, I'm usually checking the time at a pretty good clip. I don't know why. It's just something I'm just checking. It's not really because I care about efficiency, and I'm not because I'm bored or something. I don't know. I just end up kind of looking at the time. And so, and especially when I know that I'm entering that last, hour of play, I'm looking at the time because I want to try to not stop in the middle of something. So once we get into like, okay, I've got 30 or 40 minutes left, I'm going to start looking a little bit more, so that if it looks like a combat or something is likely and that combat isn't going to be resolved in the time we have left, then I'll be like, okay, we're going to end here, kind of thing. But yeah, put some notes in front of you, anything that's going to help you keep some of these things that you want to remember in front of mind. Timeout, go into the hood for review. That's right. Last 2 minutes of the session is automatic booth reviews.
And think. And take a few seconds, maybe up to 10 seconds or longer, to react, to figure out what to do. And you can make it transparent to your players. Like, hey guys, I got a loading wheel here. The wheel's spinning. I'm thinking, just give me a couple seconds here, and then re-engage. Question: the characters are about to kill the villain in one round. How do I avoid the unexpected anticlimax?
Oh, this should be interesting.
A, give the villain some extra hit points or a protracted death.
Right.
B, with its dying breath, have the villain summon a greater threat. C, have the villain assume a new form after its first form is destroyed.
Don't like that. I know it's a trope, but I still don't like it.
Enjoy the anticlimax.
I don't mind the anticlimax sometimes, but all those are really great options. Giving them a little extra hit points, uttering a curse after they die that leads to a whole nother adventure, or bringing in the actual real villain of the overarching story. That kind of stuff is all fantastic.
Yes. Having the vampire implode and then another creature sort of arise from its innards is also a great example.
Yes.
Or a swarm of creatures, as the case may be.
Right.
And like you, I think it's okay to enjoy the anticlimax. And the reason I feel that way is players often are overjoyed.
I feel like that multiple forms of the villain just gets overused. It's a real video gamey thing.
Down in one round,
and I just don't love it. I mean, I'm sure it's not just video games. I'm sure it's in animes and other things, but I just...
And
It bugs
that is
me.
often a good thing.
I
And
don't
even
like it.
narratively, there are some of my favorite movies are like all of this effort to get to this one villain, and the villain is gone in seconds.
Yes.
Sometimes that's very satisfying to me because I've
Yes.
seen this narrative before. But yeah, like that moment where you just like end the villain immediately, that makes you feel like the hero.
Right. Question. The characters are about to die. How do I avoid a TPK?
Let them, if they
Hey.
die, they die.
The dice giveth and the dice taketh away.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
B, have the enemy show mercy or make a tactical error.
Okay.
C,
Mercy might
stage
work.
a timely
I mean, they're already
rescue.
dead, so what kind of tactical error
Or
could they
D,
make?
divine intervention.
All those are viable. I avoid divine intervention, though I do always like to have a plan B. If the characters do die, I like to have a secondary adventure that has to do with them all dying. As if maybe there is a curse on them, or there is a deity that wants to intervene by a cost.
Yes, so I actually ruled out the let them die, but I actually prefer your answer. That it can be viable if you have a plan post death,
right,
to keep the campaign going or to keep the players engaged in the campaign.
I mean, this is obviously a narrative thing. For the most part, I mean, even narrative campaigns will generally have some kind of backup plan. I guess it depends, right? Because, I mean, in a sandbox campaign, if they die, they die. And then new folks come and pick up the cause. But I could see if you're playing, Lord of the Rings, the game, as a narrative kind of game, that the idea that the Fellowship just dies and then Sauron gets the ring and wins kind of by default can be unsatisfying for the players and unsatisfying for you as the GM, because that's not I think oftentimes GMs, we want climactic conclusions. We want this kind of these epic things to happen. And if we are in a game where all the player characters dying would just bring things to a sputtering halt like that, then it probably does at that point behoove us to look at other options. Me, I go with the sandbox. I go with that. Somebody else will find the ring. Presumably the same forces of fate that kept the ring at bay from Sauron are still operating, and something else will happen, and maybe some other group will have to recover the ring from whoever killed the characters, presuming that whoever killed the characters is even aware of the ring, or they'll have to track it down, or something else, right? You just kind of, the story keeps on going. But speaking of the more modern games, and his audience is mainly for your modern 5e kind of players, this advice makes sense, even if it's not necessarily the way I would go.
Pain, either as their characters or in some new form. Maybe they're playing ghosts for a while.
Yeah.
Maybe they're playing vampires for a while.
They get trapped in the afterlife.
Exactly.
Bureaucracy.
So actually, even though I ruled out let them die, that could be a viable option if the campaign can survive it.
Yeah.
Question: how do I become a better DM? A.
Ooh, eat your broccoli.
Watch other DMs. B. Eat your broccoli. C. Build a better game table. Or D. Steal Matthew Mercer's mojo.
I don't know. Like, you should have green vegetables. I know that now that I'm older, but I think stealing Matt Mercer's mojo, I would be irresponsible to condone taking his mojo. That
Sorry, Ian said in the chat, but Todd, this isn't even my final form. Oh my gosh, yeah, give the that could be fun in a certain kind of game. Having these forms, as much as I dislike it for villains, could be kind of fun. But that would be awesome. I don't know what I would do if my player said to me, but I haven't even reached my final form. I'd probably say something like, "This is as final as your form gets. Goodbye."
That's his mojo. Find your own. So I kind of feel like watching other Dungeon Masters is really inspiring. So
the Dave, I got your Austin Powers reference. Nicely done.
I would even go farther to say that, artists learn by appreciating other artists' work. Writers get better by reading other writers.
So I don't disagree with this advice, which is basically, how do you become a better DM? Watching other DMs. And look, my whole channel is predicated on talking about GM stuff. So I would certainly never say that that's bad advice. I would be dooming myself to the extent that I'm not already doomed. But I do think just be aware. And this is the big thing that happens with the whole Mercer effect and all these things. When you're watching these big streaming channels, is that what they're called now, or games like Critical Role, like Dimension 20, like some of these other ones, you got to remember who they are and what they're doing. They are, at least now, I think the bigger ones are, they're profitable. They're doing this. It's not that they don't enjoy playing or they want to play, but it's also a business and enterprise. They are, for a lot of them, out of all of them, very talented in what they're doing. The Critical Role, obviously, they're all voice actors. So they bring a lot of the skills that they have honed and trained in for years to bear on playing the game. They have excellent atmospheres in which to play. They have sets and all these things. And because it's an enterprise, I think one of the things that gets overlooked is not just that it's for money or whatever. And I don't believe that they pre-plan everything. I mean, obviously, I think the GMs have plans where to go, but I don't think that it's pre-plotted out while the players being in on what they're doing. But all the players are playing it for entertainment value as a group. They understand they're putting forth a product and they want to present the best product they can. Your home game is not going to be playing for that. And I think one of the things I would encourage you to try to get your players on board with is not just playing for themselves, but playing for the table. If I'm playing the game, don't just play for my own personal enjoyment. Oftentimes that leads to that, like, well, this is what my player would do, not my character would do nonsense, where I do something dickish because it will give me a giggle, even though I know it's bringing the game to a halt and maybe annoying 3 or all the rest of the players or whatever. It's playing for our own enjoyment. But when you're watching those big streaming games, they have a goal, which is to be entertaining, and they're going to all work in that direction. And being that they're all, like in the case of case of Critical Role, they're all acting background. They're all well aware of improv techniques and ways to kind of work as a group to put on this performance. The players at your table aren't going to have all that. You can get some of the way there with stuff, but you have to keep in mind when you're watching them that it's going to be a lot easier to GM for one of those groups where they are more likely to be in on what you're selling and go with it because they know that they're making this entertainment product than it is for players who are going to sit back and say, like, try to question you on everything, or rules lawyer to death, or do all these different things. Not saying you can't achieve the same kind of games that they do, but it's going to take a lot of work. And you have to be aware that where they are when you're watching them versus where you are when you're absorbing this information. Oh, and Magnus points out, what does better mean to you? This is also true. Think about what you're trying to get to.
And seeing what they do well and what they don't. I think the same is true for DMs. If you watch other DMs, you can learn from them. You can say, oh, I like what this DM does in this situation. Oh, I love how this other DM keeps the plot moving. Or I love how this other DM sort of embraces the characters' backgrounds and backstories and uses that as fuel for adventures. So I heartily encourage the watching of other DMs, which was not available to me back in the ancient days.
Yeah.
Living out in the middle of nowhere with no internet. Now it is a thing, and we should take advantage of it.
We didn't have live streams and stuff, but like maybe you'd be in a D&D game and you're like, this is how I would have done it.
Yes.
This is a totally okay reaction as a player to have, and be like, start thinking,
yes,
this is the time I want Dungeon Master because this is how I would have seen this story,
yes,
or how I would have handled things.
Right. And when I finally did find a D&D club, there were DMs there that I didn't like.
Right.
I thought they weren't good. And I learned from them too.
Yeah.
By experiencing them, by watching them, I saw, oh, I never want to do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Question. How do I know if I'm doing a good job as DM? A, you're having fun.
Yeah.
B, your players are having fun. C, y'all can't wait to play again. D, you did everything Chris Perkins told you to do.
I'm gonna say, well, I'll always say what you did, what Chris Perkins told you to do. But yeah, I mean, I think you're gonna have days as a dungeon master where you didn't feel like you did a good job, or maybe you didn't have fun because you don't feel that way, but your players clearly did have fun and loved the adventure. I've had that happen. If you are having fun, you did a good job. If they're having fun and you're stressed out, you still did a good job. If they listen to you, I feel like they've been doing a good job.
I actually ruled out the last one. I don't think it's actually important that
fair.
You do everything.
Yeah, I just want to stop there. Like, I'm going to just pause on this one just to say that, this is one of those things I think GMs have a lot of trouble with, is just, what is the word I'm looking for? Embracing the fact that they did a good job. or acknowledging or realizing they did a good job. Because I think what other Todd, Watsy Todd, mentioned about coming out of sessions where you don't feel great about it, but all the players had fun. And yet, and you often hear GMs saying that the players all said they had fun, but I still feel horrible about my game. And it's just that allowing yourself to have that fun, or just to appreciate, take in what your players are saying. If your players are saying they had fun, they probably had fun. If your players aren't saying anything, then maybe there's a chance they didn't have fun. But take them at their word. If they came and you weren't begging them for compliments, and they just said, "Oh, that was an awesome session. Can't wait for next week when we figure out this, or I do that, or whatever." Then just take it in. Accept it. Don't fight it. And because oftentimes the things that we will put on ourselves and will make ourselves feel bad for some little mistake we did, or something we didn't do, or something we did do that we end up thinking was a bad thing, and all that gets going to go away in the wash. And a lot of the stuff that we may feel was vital, important, maybe the players never even saw because it was on our list of things to do. We just skipped it, missed it, whatever. The players didn't know about it. So they're having fun. But I think the hardest thing, not the hardest thing, but one of the hardest things I think for a lot of GMs is just to accept that they did a good job. Despite whatever things didn't go their way, despite that they didn't pitch a perfect game out there, they did good. Take it. Now, by the same token, I will say that players, for the most part, despite what you read on the internet, are pretty loath to say bad things about a game. It has to be a really, really horrible experience for me to say something, especially in person. Like, I may leave the game and I'm like going home or talking to the players saying like, that was terrible. I'm not going to say anything unless it was truly awful. So don't get in a white tower over, well, my players haven't said anything bad or whatever, and so I must be running, don't use the inverse, was like, I must be running a great game because nobody's complained, because people are often not going to complain, especially if you're all friends outside the game. That's a hard thing to do. But if people are telling you you're having fun, please accept it, because most likely 99% of the time they are having fun. So go with it. As Brian Smith says, I really think it's easy to get wrapped up in all the conversation about what is right or wrong or optimal or whatever and be hard on yourself. Yeah, right. And I think we give ourselves unrealistic expectations. The Dave says, if everything in a game is going how you planned, you are probably railroading. Well, this is, I mean, I won't go that far, because I think sometimes, and I think this will happen, you get a good sense. Like, even when I was a player in some games, I could get in the situation and I could say like, oh yeah, like with 100% certainty or 99.9% certainty, this person's going to do this in that situation. And I think when you get to that point, you can start to work that in and figure it out. So I don't want to downplay that element, because at a certain point we all have tendencies, and you kind of read those tendencies, and you can just say like, I know if I put this thing out there, they're going to, at least these two players, whoever, they're going to go for it. Sometimes you just do know that and you can go with it. But if probably over time, if you're like, the players are never deviating or whatever, either you're not giving them the space to deviate, or they just don't want to, and you might want to figure out which one it is. But again, if everyone's having fun, railroads is it really a pejorative phrase, right? Some people like and have no problem being in a linear adventure, and that's also totally fine. One more thing, and then just going up a little bit, Magnus says imposter syndrome is a hell of a drug. That it is. I just wish it had some positive effect, because it seems all negative. Hey Phil, glad you joined in. But yeah, head back to the back of the screen, the top of the stream. There's a lot, but we're almost done. What do we got left here? All right, we've got like 8 minutes left, maybe less. So let's finish this bad boy off.
I tell you to do, because I am just one DM
Exactly.
offering some advice. I am not to be trusted completely.
It's very fair. This whole video has been like a trap.
It is a trap. Yes, absolutely.
It's a trap.
I have heard it said that there is no wrong way to play D&D.
Yeah.
I disagree. I think that if nobody is having fun, you're playing D&D wrong.
Yeah.
But if everybody's having fun,
right,
you're playing D&D right.
I can agree with that.
If you're having fun, your players are having fun, and you all can't wait to play again, congratulations. You're doing a great job as a DM. The last point I want to leave with is this. How you DM is as unique as how you paint or how you write. And no two DMs are alike, and that's how it should be.
Man, this is another one they should put up on posters and meme out there. Don't expect your GM to be like some GM that you might see on a famous or not so famous stream. And then if you're a GM, don't try to be some other GM that you might see on a famous or not so famous stream. And this is something you got to learn when you're writing. Obviously, the same thing you're doing art. You could look at other artists, you can read other writers, but they'll always say at some point you have to find your own voice. And everyone's going to have their own style. You got to find it, you got to hone it. And the only way you can hone it is to embrace it and try to be it, and not try to be Matt Mercer, not try to be Chris Perkins, not try to be me, not try to be somebody else. Just try to be yourself. And that can be hard. And part of it comes in there as, was it the Dave or somebody mentioned the imposter syndrome? Maybe it was Magnus who mentioned imposter syndrome. Like all that stuff's going to try to stop you from realizing that, but that's going to be the key. And then I think the more you get into allowing yourself to be yourself, then I think the more comfortable you get. Because I think part of what makes it hard is because we are looking at all these people and we're kind of trying to be them in some way or be like them. And we can take things from all these different influences, but ultimately we have to find that synthesis that is our own style, our own voice. And, you know, we should be striving to find that and then embrace it as a GM. And then our players have to be open to receiving it and not expect somebody else, because we're not that somebody else. We are who we are. Brian Smith says, well, what am I supposed to do with all these Matt Mercer vests and Todd Spindrifts? Man, if I could ever get the sponsorship for Spindrifts, I don't even know what I would do.
With that, I'd like to segue into a little bit of a promotion here. The original D&D starter set had an adventure in it called Lost Mine.
Okay, I think I'm gonna. All right, I'm gonna pause. I think he's getting into their new adventure, so I think the advice portion is over. Somebody could let me know if it is not over. In any case, what did you think of the Chris Perkins advice? I thought it was all really good. I mean, there's a couple of things I could quibble with, but really it's all about perspective. And I think certainly appreciating who his main audience is and who he's trying to speak to. But I think there's something you could take from that advice that would work regardless of which edition you're playing, and probably regardless of which role-playing game you're playing. So that was really good. And I think it speaks to also that as much as we talk about, we'll compare and contrast old school role-playing, you know, OSR, whatever, versus 5th edition new school playing. When you get down to it, a lot of the principles are similar. It's just that there's that culture of play, that culture of game that's changed a little bit, but so much stuff still applies. And so it's probably something that's interesting to keep in mind, that maybe, even though, especially what we read in the internet, which can often get blown out of proportion, and everyone's looking at the most extreme examples that show up, that maybe in terms of what we're really all striving for is we're very much more alike than we are different. It's just a matter of, I think, building that context around so that when someone approaches our game, or we're approaching that other game or someone else's game, that we're able to communicate those different contexts and find the play styles and find the ways of playing that we all like to play. The Dave says, if you know how dice work, you can run anything. Pretty true. RPG Grandma says pretty standard stuff. Yeah, it is standard stuff. I look, there's nothing, oh my gosh. I don't think there's anything. I'm not even sure what something would have to be non-standard, but I think it's important that, to me, when I look at it, it's like, here's the person who is representing D&D. His title in this stream is, he's D&D architect. He's on the official channel and he's giving advice. So what he says is going to be seen by a lot more people than are ever going to see anything I do. And it has that, what I can't possibly have, which is the authority of coming from Wizards. Now, I know a lot of people think poor things about Wizards, but a lot of people are going to come to YouTube or come to something, and they're going to see this is from Wizards, from the architect of D&D. They're going to take this with a lot of seriousness that people aren't going to read from the blogosphere. Oh, some random blogger said, some dude wrote on Blogger something or other. That's nice. What did Chris Perkins say? Well, he's saying the same stuff that we're all saying. So while, yeah, it isn't paving new ground, I'm hoping that it will reach a wider audience, because like I said, I think that all this advice is really good. It's not new. It's not an epiphany or something. It doesn't make me see the game in a whole new way, but it's really good, solid advice. I think I could definitely say that if a lot of folks took this advice to heart, it would probably better a lot of games. And it's in a way, a counter to a lot of the discourse you see online. This seems to be in the direction that I think, like, yeah, this is good GMing advice, right? So that's kind of where I came out. But it was definitely interesting to watch and listen to what he had to say. Let's see. Brian Smith says, seems good. Always good to have perceived authority on a topic, validate individual interpretations. Yep. RPG Grandma says, principles, same, execution choice differs. Brian Smith asks, what does the bro-OSR think of this? I don't want to know. They're still haggling over, rules is written first edition. I still want to see. So maybe someone could point this out to me. I want, and I'd be happy to watch a stream, but I want to see an unedited stream of some of these guys playing first edition rules as written. And it needs to include everything, not rules as written, but we're going to pick and choose which rules, all rules. I just want to see it. I just want to see it. And then after that, I will shut up about anything about that. The Dave says they make games. They have that kind of authority. Yes, right. Now I have the authority of my pulpit here, which is the size of a pinhead compared to others, but I'll take it. Anyhow, folks, man, I've been on over 2 hours. It's time to go. I'm out of Spindrift, number one. So Spindrift, where are you at? I'm totally out. My tea is gone. My voice is failing. We've watched the stream. Said about as much as I can say on it. So, folks, I'll let you get back to whatever it is you're doing. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching and listening to this. Game on, everybody. And I'll talk to you later. Bye now.